Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
Why do I have to clean up after him? Mary asked in a deliberately squeaky voice, her lips puckered. You don't have to, honey. I just asked you to help because I can't do it myself. You shouldn't have had so many kids if you couldn't handle it, Mary muttered. Emma ignored the jab. What was a teenage girl to do, especially if she had to help raise her younger siblings instead of the usual teenage chores, which she did quite well, despite her objections? You can understand her. Fiddling with kids is not something you want to do at 15. Unlike many people, especially those with many children, Emma did not think that such help was the sacred duty of the eldest child, especially if he happened to be born a girl. Therefore, she was very grateful to her daughter. If it had been her will, she would never have put such a burden on Mary, but she had no special options. She really couldn't handle it all on her own. All of her children, Emma had given birth to quite deliberately. A large family had been her dream since she herself had been a child. The woman carried this desire through her life, and in the end it came true. She had everything she could dream of, 5 beautiful children, and a loving husband, an endless number of relatives ready to help and support her. Mary was considerably older than her siblings. After a difficult labor and caring for a weak, sickly child, Emma could not decide for a long time even to have a second one. However, when the eldest daughter turned 9, James was still born. 2 years later, Kayla was born, and after 3 more twins, Cindy and Ethan. So they lived a large, close-knit family that included Emma's husband, Edward, and his parents. Their home was large, spacious, and bright, and in addition, there was always someone from their spouse's numerous relatives. Aunts and uncles, brothers, sisters, relatives, cousins, second cousins, third cousins. In short, there was someone to help with the children and household chores. It was all very recent, a year ago, but Emma sometimes felt that these memories belonged to some very old times, or maybe they were not memories at all, but dreams and dreams. In their present situation, it all seemed utterly unreal. Trouble came, as often happens, quite unexpectedly. Exactly a year ago, she was at home alone. Except for the children, her husband was away on business. His numerous relatives were also busy with something. Her parents, who usually lived with them, had gone to the dacha when the first warm days came. They always left for the whole summer, though, and the rest of the family was soon to join them. They stayed in town only because Edward still had some business to attend to. Yes, Mary needed to pass her midterm exams to be accepted into 10th grade the following year. James, 5, was in his room playing with his 3-year-old sister, happily showing his sister his collection of cars. Only occasionally did Emma stop by to check on the kids. Her room was just behind the wall, so if anything happened, she would be able to react quickly to the danger. Mary had gone out with her friends, so the only thing Emma had to worry about was the newborn twins. Fortunately, unlike her eldest daughter, they were in excellent health and were, as they called it, gift children. They almost never screamed and were quite capable of occupying themselves with a variety of rattles. Also, on some nonverbal level, they could communicate with each other and were quite content in each other's company. In short, the day passed, as it always did, cheerfully and quietly. It seemed that it would always be like that. That time had frozen, that now there would be an endless June day outside the window, warm but not too warm, cozy and sunny. Emma felt absolutely happy. It was then that she realized that she had finally achieved the realization of her most important dream, and now she was truly happy. Toward evening, Mary returned and began to tell her mother how wonderful her day had been and what interesting things had happened on the walk. Emma listened to her daughter half-heartedly as she was concentrating on feeding the babies. Giving a bottle of formula to both of them at once was not as easy as she had thought, and feeding them one at a time, they couldn't stand it and started crying together. As a result, neither of them could eat. Mary, however, did not need an attentive listener. She was overwhelmed by the impressions that came out. The main thing for her was to tell about them as soon as possible, before the emotions tore the girl from the inside, and whether her words reached someone's ears was not so important. After feeding the younger children and making sure they were sleeping sweetly in their beds, Emma took care of the older ones. Setting the table in the living room, she brought in an afternoon snack. James and Mary, of course, were already able to eat on their own, but little Kayla had not quite gotten the hang of the spoon yet, so from time to time Emma came to help her. She didn't eat, she didn't want to, and she was used to eating in the company of her husband, who would be back soon. When the children had eaten, she began to prepare dinner for the two of them. No guests were expected that evening. Nevertheless, the process still dragged on for a couple of hours. Emma, having caught the culinary inspiration, could not stop and started to prepare not only the hot dish, but also the dessert. It was only after putting the cake in the freezer and checking once again that the kids were okay that she glanced at the clock and realized how much time had passed. Her husband should have been back about half an hour ago, but he was still gone. Emma wasn't particularly worried about it. There was no telling what might have caused the delay. Surely he was about to show up, otherwise he would have called to warn her that he had a change of plans. But another half hour passed, then an hour, 2, 3, and he was still gone. That's when Emma began to worry. And Mary, who knew her father's habits, sensed something wrong. The two of them began to call Edward, but to no avail. Time after time, the mechanical voice reported that the subscriber's phone was switched off or was out of range. After the 10th call, his further recommendation to call back later seemed absolutely mocking to the woman. Having failed to wait for her husband and father, everyone went to bed, all except Emma, who was to be on night duty at the baby's crib, and in any case, she would hardly be able to sleep. Sitting beside the cradle, the woman listened every minute for the key in the lock or the creak of the door, but all was silent. Edward did not appear during the night or in the morning. It was then that she first asked Mary to watch the younger children, and she went to the nearest police station to file a missing persons report. She couldn't imagine what else there was to do in such a situation. The officer on duty didn't take her problem too seriously. He was extremely reluctant, but still accepted the report from her. However, he remarked, "Your husband is an adult. Perhaps he has some reasons of his own for not showing up at home. Then he would have definitely given notice. He always calls or writes if he's going to be more than an hour late." Emma objected, "And he always keeps his phone charged and never turns it off. Things happen. Maybe he went out with an old friend and forgot about everything, or even worse. Not for him, of course, but for you." "How dare you?" Emma exclaimed indignantly. "Look, I understand you perfectly well, but alas, such cases happen all over the place. You can't imagine how many people come to us to complain about missing wives and husbands. As a rule, they are quite decent people, and in the end, after a week or two, our employees find this decent man in bed with his mistress. My husband is not like that." Emma objected rather sluggishly, more out of inertia. It was clear that she couldn't prove anything to the policeman, and why should she? He had taken a statement, so they would have to deal with the case anyway. Nothing else from the police was required now, so the woman went home after all, Her children were waiting for her. On her way back, Emma secretly hoped that her husband would be home by now. Maybe he really had met some old buddy and was now sitting by the twins' cradle, repenting for making the family worry. The house, however, was as empty as Emma had left it, and to her surprise, not only Edward, but none of his relatives were to be found there. It had never happened before that no one had visited them for 2 whole days. A bored Mary sat by the twins' crib, and Kayla and James were nestled on the mat right at her feet. They were no longer playing, but sitting quietly, snuggled up against each other and their older sister. Both of them looked a little dejected. When James heard the sound of Mom's footsteps, he looked up hopefully and then lowered his head, obviously realizing that Emma had returned alone. When is Daddy coming back? Kayla asked bodily. I don't know, sweetie. I hope it's soon. Only Emma had a thought that should have crossed her mind last night, but hadn't. Apparently, due to too much anxiety gripping the woman. She should have called her husband's parents, his sister, his brother. Maybe they know something? And if they didn't, at least they should be informed of what had happened. As soon as Emma thought of that, she immediately grabbed the phone. Over the next few hours, she called seemingly everyone. Her husband's relatives, his friends, acquaintances, even business associates. No one knew anything, but everyone expressed extreme concern about what had happened. That evening, Edward did not come home again. The next few months were what took Emma from her cherished dream to her worst nightmare. Edward never showed up. His relatives suddenly stopped visiting the family as well, and what's more, they didn't even call. Apparently, they did not care about the woman and her children. The children, in turn, from nice obedient kids, began to turn into uncontrollable monsters. That is, the twins, of course, remained the same, and Mary, though noticeably dejected, but somehow kept herself in control. Only occasionally the girl let her emotions take over reason and snapped, then at her mother, then at her brother and sister. But James and Kayla were as if mad. They didn't listen and broke and smashed everything they saw in front of them. Worse, they even started fighting with each other. More precisely, the older brother constantly bullied his little sister, and she, in turn, was unable to fight back. But she was perfectly able to set up some meanness in secret. Emma understood perfectly well why it was happening, of course. The children had a real shock and had no idea how to deal with it. After all, in addition to the fact that their father had disappeared, all the other relatives had disappeared somewhere. They were used to the fact that the house was noisy, crowded, and cheerful. Besides, the little ones perfectly read the mood of their mother and older sister. But only this understanding did not give Emma an answer to the main question: what to do with all this? In addition to everything else, financial problems began to arise, of which the woman had no idea until then. However, the money in the special family account, to which only she and Edward had access, was gradually beginning to melt away, and there was nowhere for new money to come from. The missing husband didn't work, and therefore didn't get a paycheck. Emma, burdened with children and having neither education nor experience, could not even imagine from which side she should take the question of finding a job. And the expenses, by the way, were enormous, no matter how hard she tried to save money. One evening there was a knock on the door of the house. Emma opened it and found a scowling policeman on the doorstep. After introducing himself in full uniform, he asked permission to enter. Without waiting for an answer, he pushed his way into the hallway and asked, "You're Wilson Emma, right?" "Yeah." Confused, the woman confirmed. "So Wilson Edward, registered at this address and missing 3 months ago, is your husband?" "Yes." Again Emma answered briefly. "We found him," said the policeman. She shrieked with joy. but immediately faltered as she looked at the grim face of the policeman. Slowly, very slowly, as if breaking through an invisible barrier, the meaning of his words came to her. "No," she whispered. "It can't be. Don't tell me what. I'm sorry, but your husband is probably no longer alive. Of course, we can't be sure it's him. Not until we've conducted an identification procedure. Will you be able to attend, or should we contact his other close relatives?" Emma wanted to say something, but she felt dizzy and the ground seemed to slip away from under her feet. She swayed and grabbed the door jamb with her hand, but it did nothing to help her. After a few seconds, the woman fainted. She still forced herself to come to the lineup, realizing that if she didn't see the body, she wouldn't be able to believe and accept the inevitable. Only after a brief glance at the face, she immediately realized that there was no mistake. Before her, on the cold morgue table, lay her husband, no doubt dead. After the identification, the policeman told her at length what they thought had happened. For some reason, mentioning details that Emma would have preferred to know nothing about. It appeared that her husband had been victimized by some inept hooligans. They had robbed him of his wallet and then realized that he had seen their faces and would be able to point them out to the police, after which her poor Edward had suffered injuries incompatible with life. "Did you capture them?" was all she asked, trying to disengage herself from the detailed description of her husband's injuries. "Not yet," sighed the policeman, "but the investigation is ongoing. I promise you, we will find whoever did this." "Well, find them." Indifferently, the woman thought, but said nothing out loud, realizing how wild it would sound in this situation. Right now, she didn't really care whether the bastards were captured or not. It wouldn't bring her husband back. And she didn't even think about the fact that they might be a danger to someone else. However, as it turned out, this was not the worst ordeal that cruel fate had prepared for her. At least, not the last. She was wrong. Edward's relatives didn't give a damn about her. They all as one hated her fiercely, but before the tragedy, they had smiled hypocritically in her face and cooed at her children. Now they were finally showing their true natures. They told her everything they thought. Over the next week, she found out that they thought she had married Edward solely because he was rich and successful, that she had tied him down with her belly and then kept having children to hold on to. When she realized that Mary would soon grow up and that leverage would be lost to her, of course, they all thought she was no match for Edward. She was from an extremely poor family and an orphan. The only reason she didn't end up in an orphanage was because her maternal grandmother had agreed to take her in. But she was so strict and so driven, the poor girl, that she sometimes thought that she would be better off in an orphanage. For all these revelations could hardly hurt Emma now. The woman was trying to get over her grief. After all, no matter what anyone said, she truly loved her husband. Yes, in addition, she still had to take care of the children and think about how exactly she would now feed and clothe them. Emma married very early, barely 18 years old, and almost immediately afterwards became pregnant with Mary. Edward's salary was more than enough to provide for the whole family, so the woman had no motivation to get an education or look for a job. She saw herself in no other role than that of a caring mother and wife. The entire household was on her shoulders, and this suited both her and her husband. And what to do now she had no idea. Even if she is taken somewhere, for example, a saleswoman, she will have to work literally 24 hours a day, without days off, just to provide her family with everything they need. And who at this time will watch the children, especially the twins? In the summer, Mary could still take care of them, though she wouldn't like it. But then what? However, there was still the inheritance. It would be possible to sell the house and buy a more modest dwelling, maybe even a small apartment in a high-rise. Ideally, in this case, there would still be some money for the first time. And Edward's personal account would probably have some money saved up, which would now go to her. And by the time the savings came to an end, she could probably come up with something. But those plans were not destined to materialize. It turned out that the house they were living in was registered to Edward's parents, so they could forget about selling it. Moreover, Emma's ultimatum demanded that she immediately vacate the premises to which she had no rights, and take your Mary, you've already ruined her. And the little asshole, too, perhaps, and the younger ones will stay with us. We will bring them up ourselves, after all, our grandchildren, Edward's own blood. Her mother-in-law told her. No way, Emma said fiercely. You will not have my children. So where will you go with them? You're going to the garbage dump. That's where you belong, but spare the children. It's none of your business where I go. Emma cut me off. Well, as you know anyway, very soon the guardianship service will take them away from you, and then they will definitely come to us. Threatened her mother-in-law. That's when Emma remembered about her grandmother's old house, or rather her own, because the old lady, despite her bad temper and strained relations with her granddaughter, still left her everything she had as an inheritance. A small plot of land, and at that time not too strong house. It was located in a remote village, which was not easy to reach without a car. Obviously not the best option to move there with children, but Emma had no other options, and this was at least a roof over her head. Mary, of course, would have to be moved to the village school. She couldn't go to the city every day. She won't like it, but she's old enough to understand the necessity of such a step. What? Mary's up in arms. An old wreck in the middle of nowhere and a country school? Are you crazy or what? Don't be rude to your mother, replied Emma, more tired than angry. Or do you prefer the option of sleeping at the station? Just say the word and we'll be right back. No way, Mary snorted. Look, darling, we'll try to think of something. I hope it's just a temporary measure. You've only got 5 months left till the end of the year, and it'll be winter vacation soon, and we'll see what can happen in the meantime. Maybe we can sell the house. All right, the daughter softened. I'll survive somehow. They rode in the train, loaded with suitcases, strollers, and children. Mary held the older one's hands tightly, keeping them from scattering and getting into trouble. Emma had the twins in her arms, sleeping without a care in spite of their less than comfortable position. They were the only ones of the group unaware of the difficult situation they were in, so there was nothing to worry about. The train took about 2 hours to get to the station, and then the family had to take a bus, which, according to the schedule, ran every half hour till late afternoon. Emma remembered very well that in her childhood it was impossible to believe this schedule, but at least at this stage of the journey they were lucky. The old, cramped, gasoline-guzzling bus pulled up to the stop the minute the family and all their luggage reached it. For another 40 minutes they jolted along a bad country road, bouncing on endless bumps, falling into holes, but the most difficult part of the journey was undoubtedly the last one. It was impossible to do it otherwise than on foot, only by private car. No public transportation went directly to the village. They had to walk first along the same country road, and then turn into the forest, then get out into a large field, and then the village they were looking for began very near. All this difficult road took no more than an hour, provided, of course, that the weather was good, and the person walking on it was an adult and physically strong, and moreover light. They had to wade through the snowy debris, and besides, a snowstorm was about to start. And all this with heavy luggage and small children in their arms. But there was nothing to do. They had to go. As long as the path led them along the road, it was still bearable. In the forest, however, in spite of the fact that the path was very wide, it became quite difficult. At this time of year, there were seldom cars, much less pedestrians. Consequently, the whole road was covered with loose snow. Suddenly, when the woman was desperate to break through the snow, she heard the roar of an engine from behind. Turning around, she saw a huge SUV driving slowly but surely along the path. Such a car was not afraid of any obstacles, but despite this, the driver drove quietly and cautiously. But at least there will be a road in the morning, thought Emma, hurriedly pulling aside the children and suitcases. However, and to her surprise, the car slowed down next to them. The driver's side window rolled down and a man about her age or a little older stared at them. His eyes were filled with shock and confusion. "Where are you going in this weather?" he asked. "To the village." Emma replied, "I understand your surprise, but we have very good reasons to go there right now. It's a long story." "I'm sure there are." The man chuckled. "Hop in the car. I think you'll fit, though it'll be a little cramped. I'm on my way to the same place." Emma could not have imagined such a fortunate turn of events. No matter how many times she had walked along this road, no matter how many cars had passed her, she had never had anyone offer her a ride. Somehow, when she saw the car, she hadn't even thought of it as an option. Emma stowed 2 suitcases and 2 strollers in the roomy trunk, and with the middle children and Ethan, settled into the back seat. Mary, on the other hand, carefully took Cindy in her arms and sat next to the driver. When he was sure that everyone was in the car, he stepped on the gas, and the car continued to slowly make its way through the snow. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked. "It's late. My mother lives in this village," the man explained with some annoyance in his voice. How many times I offered her to move to the city, but she wouldn't go for it. She'd gotten used to her home for many years. It would be hard for her. Then I suggested that she move to a more decent village, to this one. God forbid that even an ambulance will take 2 hours to get there. No, she doesn't want to. She says she was born here and will die here. The driver sighed heavily. "So I go to her when I finish work not too late." "Yeah, but it's less often than I'd like. I'm worried about her terribly. She's a perky girl, but she's still old." "I understand." Emma said, "Well, now it's your turn. It's a long way in this snow. Tell us your long story. We'll consider it a toll." Through the front mirrors, Emma saw him smiling broadly and couldn't help smiling back, then told him everything from the time her husband didn't come home one night to the last ugly fight with Edward's kin. She wasn't even allowed to take most of the children's things, and some things, like the twins' cradle, she wouldn't have been able to drag away with her anyway. Her husband's monetary inheritance, which was her only hope, as it turned out, was to be divided among all his numerous relatives according to his will. Of course, and Emma and the children printed a share, but it was a very modest amount, on which they could hardly last even a month. So I was left with only my grandmother's old house. Sadly, she summarized, that's where we're headed, and what to do next. Frankly speaking, I have no idea. Do you happen to know if there are any jobs in the village? Maybe a cleaner at the school or something like that. The driver thought hard, then said, "You know, I have an idea. Maybe you'll agree to look after my mom, help her around the house and all that. I won't be stingy on payment. It's really important to me." "I'd love to," Emma said. At that moment, they were just approaching the outskirts of the village, and when they asked which plot of land to drop them off at, and heard the answer, the man suddenly laughed out loud and then explained, "You will go to the neighboring house for work." Emma was afraid to believe that everything was going so well. However, when they drove up to her grandmother's old house, the good mood that had begun to appear fell below the plinth again. Unpleasant memories piled a heavy stone on her heart, and the sight of the plot did not inspire optimism. The woman, of course, realized that it would look very unkept. After all, no one had come here for many years. However, she hadn't expected this level of neglect at all. The area looked more like a piece of forest that had recently been hit by a hurricane than anything else. A huge fallen tree crisscrossed the entire lot, densely overgrown with weeds, dry stalks visible even from under a meter of snow. But the house was even worse. The old logs were cracked, the window frames were coming off the walls, the glass was broken in several places, and the building itself seemed to be swaying. Maybe it had always been like this, but she'd forgotten about it. She didn't even rule out the possibility that the roof might be cracked, though, of course, she couldn't see it from the street. "Thank you." She thanked the driver dejectedly. "By the way, what's your name?" "Edward," he introduced himself. Such coincidences happen, Emma thought in surprise, but she only said her name aloud. "Well, you're settling in." His words sounded like mockery, though it was clear that he hadn't planned it at all. "And I'll come back tomorrow, and we'll discuss the terms of your work." They said goodbye. With difficulty overcoming various obstacles, Emma and Mary dragged into the house, first the younger children and then the luggage. It was good that the suitcases were heavy but light. The strollers were much heavier. Opening the front door with her old key, Emma looked around warily. The place looked almost exactly as she remembered it. The same bookcases and the same small kitchen connected by a living space, the same dilapidated staircase leading to the second floor. Just from years of neglect, the house was covered in dust and cobwebs, and yes, snow piled up from the broken windows. Leaving the children downstairs, the woman climbed up to the second floor. Despite its appearance, the stairs were quite sturdy. It was much warmer upstairs and completely free of snow. Emma exhaled a sigh of relief. So the roof was fine. Well, it wasn't a resort, but she had expected the worst. The furniture on the second floor included her old crib and another bookcase, and there was a folded crib in the corner. She made sure that its mechanism, though a little rusty, was in good working order, so it could well be used as a bed. In addition to clothes and some of the children's things, Emma had managed to take with her a set of linens, which she now used to make the bed. Designed for a giant double bed, it was too big, but the woman thought it was no big deal. If it had been the opposite, too small, it would have been much worse. Emma put the children upstairs for the night. Mary and Kayla took the cot. James got the crib. The twins only had to be put in the stroller, one for two, because they refused to fall asleep separately. The woman herself stayed downstairs. Unlike everyone else, she couldn't afford to fall asleep. She had too much to do. The first thing Emma did was to heat the stove, and an hour later it warmed the small house all over, and it was quite possible to be inside without outer clothing, at least on the second floor. The snow that had piled up immediately began to melt. The woman did her best to sweep it out the door and then wipe up the remaining wet spots with an old rag. Then she tackled the windows. Luckily, there were plenty of unwanted rags and some dry cardboard boxes in the house. It allowed her to make temporary inserts to replace the broken windows and to plug all the cracks properly. Not too reliable, but there were no other options now anyway. Emma spent the rest of the night cleaning, scrubbing the floors, dusting, removing cobwebs. Occasionally, she went up to see if the children were all right. By morning, the house looked lively, though not very cozy, and the woman was so exhausted that she didn't notice how she fell asleep in the old chair by the stove. Mary woke her up when she came down to the first floor, rattling something and grumbling noisily to herself. Emma opened her eyes and was surprised to realize that her daughter was trying to cook porridge on the stove and heat feeding bottles for the twins at the same time. Of course, she wasn't used to it, but she was not very good at it. "Oops," she said, turning around. "Sorry, Mom didn't want to wake you up. I thought I'd make breakfast myself." "You didn't wake me up." Emma lied with a slight smile. "Thanks for your help, but let me show you how to do it." They were so engrossed in the cooking process that they didn't immediately notice the insistent knock at the door. It was Edward, as promised, coming to discuss the terms of employment. The woman with him was elderly, but quite vigorous. "Meet Clara, my mother," he said. "And this is Emma. I figured as much." The younger woman smiled. "Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you," the old woman replied. However, neither her gaze nor her voice expressed the slightest bit of warmth. Either she didn't trust Emma, which was understandable, or maybe she just wasn't thrilled with her son's idea of hiring her a nanny. It was immediately clear that it would not be easy to find a common language with her ward, and so their life in the countryside went on. Mary was also getting used to the new school. Emma, in her spare time, tried to put her grandmother's old house in some kind of order, and Edward helped her. Without listening to any objections, he hired a team of workers who put in the broken glass, properly caulked the cracks, and carried out a light cosmetic repair of the room. "Look, it's no problem for me," he said. "I just can't stand to see kids living in such horrible conditions." "Thank you," Emma answered him, embarrassed. "Don't be grateful, and don't think you owe me anything, nothing like that." Clara had been really hard to deal with at first, nagging Emma and rejecting any help she offered. Even if it was really difficult to cope with the case, which she took up on her own, the mother of many children, such behavior slightly pissed her off. What a mean old woman! Does not realize that this is her job. And she does not pester her willingly. It's her duty, or maybe she really doesn't understand. Emma thought about it. She had a feeling that there was some strange reticence between them that prevented them from building normal communication. And so, once again, when the old woman almost forcefully rushed to take away her broom, the woman could not stand it. "Clara, what are you really doing? It's really hard for you to bend over. Why not let someone help you? Especially since your son pays me good money for it. You're making me feel very uncomfortable. How would I feel if I had a babysitter? No one thought of that. I'm not a frail old woman, and I'm not completely out of my mind to be under 24-hour surveillance. Not round the clock," Emma corrected her curtly. "Don't you realize Edward is worried about you? No one thinks you can't handle things on your own. He just wants to make things easier for you, and I think he thinks you're just plain bored here alone. Then he should come more often." Clara muttered, not as confidently as before. "I'm sure he comes as often as he can." "I see." Clara sighed, sinking tiredly into the chair. "I'm sorry, Emma. I shouldn't have thrown myself at you. I realize with my mind that you and my son only wish me well, but I can't help it. I keep thinking that I'm being mistaken for some kind of a woman." The old woman didn't finish. Emma knew exactly what she meant, and then a wonderful idea came into her head, an idea to reconcile her grandmother with the help she was giving her and to relieve her loneliness. Somehow she was sure Edward wouldn't object to such a thing. "Listen, Clara," she began softly. "Do you like children? Who doesn't?" The old woman replied, "Then I can offer you this variant of our further interaction. I will come to you and do all the housework, as a matter of fact, and should. You will contact me if you have even the slightest difficulty. but I will also bring my children to you and ask you to watch them. How does that sound?" Clara first looked at Emma with a puzzled look and then smiled broadly. It was clear that this option completely suited the old woman. After all, it seemed that they were helping each other in a completely reciprocal way, and she would no longer feel completely old and infirm. The proposed scheme worked perfectly. Clara treated Emma's children as if they were her own grandchildren, which she never had, but apparently wanted very much. Kayla and James, under her watchful eye, suddenly stopped their pranks and became about as sweet and obedient children as they had been before. Even the twins, who were not particularly fond of strangers, behaved quite calmly in her presence, letting her feed and change their clothes. The old woman had a real talent for parenting. "How I missed it," she said dreamily one day. "It's been so many years since I've been close to children." "You mean Edward's childhood?" Emma inquired. "Not only that. I used to work in a school as an elementary school teacher." "Why did you leave? Did it get hard?" Emma asked worriedly. "It wasn't hard." The old woman waved the question away. "I was kicked out. The director changed and immediately began, so to speak, to reshuffle the staff. He said that the elderly should rest, and the school should be taught by the young and active. Suspecting that my place was very necessary to his young and active mistress. That's quite a story." "I sympathize." "Oh, well, at least now I can babysit yours. James has an amazing aptitude for math. He should be in a special class. Only here in the village, though, there aren't any." So slowly Emma and her children settled in the village. Mary, at first shunned by the local children, in the spring was already in full swing with her new friends. James and Kayla, apparently, began to consider Clara their own grandmother, and she did not object. Soon it was time to do the planting. Emma simply caught fire with the idea of organizing a real vegetable garden on her plot. The village men gladly helped their new neighbor in clearing the plot. "It's been bothering us for a long time," one of them explained when they came to offer their help. "All over the village everything is clean and beautiful, and only here it is desolate. So, mistress, we are very glad that you came and decided to take care of the plot." The most difficult, as expected, was a huge tree that had fallen across the territory. The men, of course, led in a chainsaw and removed it piece by piece. But there was still a root adjacent to the house. Everyone was afraid that some outgrowths would not go further to the foundation. Then the removal of this part could lead to some unpleasant destruction. Eventually, after conferring, Emma's volunteer helpers came to some sort of solution. She didn't have much of a view of what exactly they were doing there, as she was busy destroying the weeds at the other end of the plot. She was distracted from this fascinating endeavor by a loud, annoyed shout from the entrance to the house. Running over, the woman found that the root had been pulled out. It hadn't caused much damage, but the porch was clearly beyond repair. With mild irritation, Emma thought she would have to make a new one. At the same moment, however, she was glad that this unfortunate incident was the only one. And then she noticed among the wooden debris some suspicious gleam. The woman bent down and looked closely and saw a small key. At first she thought it had been dropped by one of the workers, but no one could identify her find. And she soon realized that the key, old and dirty with soil, had probably been lying under the porch for years. Without realizing why, she slipped it into her jeans pocket and quickly forgot about the incident. Her thoughts were occupied with something else entirely. After all, she had not only her own vegetable garden on her shoulders, but also the neighbors', which, of course, looked much more decent, but still required quite a decent amount of work. Spring flew by without anyone noticing, and June came. Mary was very proud of herself. She managed to finish the 10th grade with straight A's. Emma had a new concern. She had to get James to school, who was to start studying in the 1st grade in September. Everything would be all right, but Clara insisted that his math talents should not be buried in the ground. She didn't like the idea of such a gifted boy going to an ordinary rural school. She suggested a boarding school for gifted children as an alternative. "Oh my God!" Emma exclaimed every time she made that suggestion. He wouldn't even be 7 in September, so how could he be alone, surrounded by strangers? But he'll come for vacations, and weekends too. I'm sure we can arrange for my son to bring him here, and then take him to school. Still, 5 days a week in a completely unfamiliar environment with strangers, he'll think we've abandoned him, that no one wants him here. Nonsense, that's what Clara said. All the children there are about the same age, and almost no one has any problems, especially not such an independent boy as James. But he will miss his sister, and Kayla will miss him too. And how is it so fundamentally different from going to a regular school? He'll have classes there too, where no one will let her go. Kids have to get used to not being together all the time. After all, Emma, you seem to forget that I'm a professional teacher and understand something about child psychology. Emma knew that there was a lot of truth in what she said, and yet she was incredibly scared to send her child away so early, even though she knew very well that this boarding school was one of the best schools in the city, and she could imagine the difficulties many people had to go through to get their children there. She had a unique chance to send James to school without making any effort at all. Clara, who still had some connections, had already arranged for him to be accepted if he passed the entrance exam. However, not only she, but even Emma herself, had no doubts about that. The exams were in August, so they had 2 months to think it over. So each time, Emma avoided the discussion under a plausible pretext, hoping that somehow, magically, a compromise solution would be found that would suit everyone. This problem, however, was firmly planted in her mind. Sometimes she would toss and turn in bed for long periods of time, unable to sleep. On such nights, Emma's thoughts wandered in circles, but never led her to a decision. And that's exactly what happened on that fateful day, which once again changed her family's life dramatically. When the woman was lying in bed, suffering from insomnia, she suddenly thought she heard a strange sound, like the crackling of fire. At first, she paid no attention to it, thinking it must be the stove. Despite the onset of summer, the nights were still chilly, and it wasn't too comfortable to sleep in the house without her. Emma was even almost able to fall asleep, lulled to sleep by these sounds that seemed quite pleasant, but after a minute she jumped up abruptly on the bed. For some time she sat in some strange tension, herself, not really understanding what was causing it. Then at last it came to her. The sound of the burning fire was clearly not coming from the stove. She had long ago gotten used to that slight crackling sound and had accepted it simply as background noise. So why should she pay attention to it all of a sudden? No, there was clearly something wrong here. Emma listened and realized the sound was coming from the wrong side of the stove. What's more, it was much louder and growing louder by the minute. There was some kind of clattering and whistling mixed in with the fiery interval. Jumping up from the bed, Emma looked around the room. It was quiet, no sign of fire. She went up to the 2nd floor to the children, all of whom were sleeping peacefully, not noticing anything unusual. Nothing was obviously burning here either. And then Emma's gaze fell on the window. For the first moment she froze, startled, then she snapped out of her seat and rushed downstairs, pulling on her jacket and grabbing her phone from the table. In the yard, she dashed to the well and grabbed a bucket of water. So, with the heavy bucket in one hand and the other dialing the fire department's number on the phone, she rushed to the Clara house, which was burning as if it were made of dry straw. As soon as she was answered, the woman mouthed the address into the receiver and disconnected. Tucking the phone into her jacket pocket, she began pouring water on the burning house, then rushed to the well and, as quickly as she could, drew another bucket. But where was it? The fire was already burning too much to be extinguished in that way. Emma tried to get through the fire to get inside the house, but she could not do so. The flames were burning intolerably and were everywhere. The windows and doors were jammed, and she could not open them. But she could see through the glass that the fire was already inside. She did not understand why Clara herself did not take any steps to save herself, did not scream, did not try to get out of the house. Maybe she wasn't there at all. A comforting thought flashed through her mind. Had she stayed the night at one of her girlfriend's houses or something? Soon other neighbors began to appear near the house, who also noticed something wrong. Someone's strong hands pulled Emma away from the door, which she was still trying to open, not realizing that her jacket was on fire. Men ran around the building, some with buckets and some with fire extinguishers, but all their efforts were in vain. The fire seemed to be getting even hotter, and now they were extinguishing not even the house itself, but the space around it. It was clear to everyone that they would not be able to save the building on their own. Emma, exhausted, sat on the ground. She didn't even feel the pain from the burns she had received, and there was only one thought in her head: if only she were not at home, if only she were not at home, if only she were not at home, if only she were not at home. "Look out!" someone shouted. And that's when the fire department arrived. I wish she wasn't inside. That was Emma's last thought before she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt that she was lying on something soft, something pleasantly cold on her forehead. She reached out and gently touched the object. Apparently, someone had placed a compress of cool water-soaked cloth on her head. Trying not to throw it off, the woman looked around and realized she was in her own home. "Thank God you're awake." She heard a familiar voice. Turning at the sound, she saw Edward sitting beside her bed. His face expressed decidedly nothing, but the woman noticed how red and swollen his eyes were. It looked like the man had been crying. She turned cold. A burned-down house was certainly very unpleasant, but hardly the kind of incident that could bring a grown man to tears. "Clara?" I asked, afraid to hear the answer. Edward made a strange sound, as if sobbing, but immediately pulled himself together. "Dead." In a husky voice, he said. Firemen dug up the body. "Looks like she was asleep when it happened. Her now. Anyway, she's being examined by a pathologist, but the firemen are sure she didn't, at least. Anyway, she didn't die from the fire. She suffocated. It's less agonizing after all." She felt tears running down her cheeks. In the short time they'd known each other, she'd grown to love that perky old woman. Not to mention how upset the children, who considered her almost their own grandmother, would be. "How are you feeling?" Edward asked. "Me?" She didn't understand. "Yeah, well, you were hurt too. Bad burns, heat stroke." That's what the paramedics said. They even wanted to take you to the hospital. But I thought if you woke up there, you'd go crazy worrying about the kids. The neighbors say you tried to break down the doors and break in despite the fire, and the fire department says that if you had succeeded, they would have found 2 bodies instead of 1. And the children? She didn't feel the pain of the burns, though she supposed she should have, but it was hard to speak. The phrases came out short, and her voice sounded strangely stilted somehow, as if she'd blown it off. Perhaps she had, though the woman didn't remember yelling anything. Upstairs, Mary was now trying to get the younger ones back into bed. They all woke up when they heard you screaming and, of course, freaked out when they realized what was happening. My screams! You don't remember? You were not only breaking into the house, you were screaming for help. In fact, it wasn't even the fire that woke up a lot of the neighbors. It was you. Too late. Emma muttered bitterly. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. Edward said harshly, the only one to blame here is the one who set the fire. Arson? His eyes widened. That's the main theory so far. There's nothing else that could have caused the house to go up in flames. Our heating was all electric, and Mom wasn't in the habit of leaving the stove on. And the fire department says that the fire, from what they saw, was not a typical domestic blaze. Yeah, well, that's a police matter. You don't have to worry about that. Emma felt herself falling back into sleep. She wanted to ask something else, but her tongue wouldn't move and her eyelids were slipping. After a few minutes, the woman realized that she was unable to fight it any longer and lost consciousness again. 3 days later, Emma fully recovered. Of course, the burns still reminded of themselves, but otherwise everything was fine, except for the extremely depressed state. On the 3rd day, she and her children were going to the funeral, but the woman found it hard to concentrate on anything, and everything she did fell out of her hands. The children, extremely saddened by Slav's death, were once again behaving disgustingly. Even the twins, who were too young to realize what had happened, cried incessantly. And just as they were about to leave, Ethan pooped his pants. Mary, change his diaper, please. Helplessly, Emma asked, why do I have to clean up after him? Mary asked in a deliberately squeaky voice, her lips pressed together. You don't have to, honey. I just asked you to help because I can't do it myself. You shouldn't have had so many kids if you couldn't handle it, Mary muttered. But Emma ignored the jab, and the girl sighed heavily and got down to business. Finally, everything was ready, and the family left the house. Edward was waiting for them at the gate in his car. He said that he would drive them to the funeral, not wanting to hear any objections. Emma, however, was too powerless to argue seriously with him on the subject. As soon as they arrived at the cemetery, Emma and Mary got out of the car, and a man in a policeman's uniform, who until that moment had been standing quietly near the fence, came toward them. As he approached, he showed the woman his ID and sternly inquired, Are you Wilson, Emma? Yeah. Confused, Emma confirmed. Emma, you're under arrest on suspicion of willful arson, damage to property, and death. What? Edward and Mary exclaimed indignantly. You must come with me to the police station immediately. Without paying attention to them, the policeman continued, This is some kind of stupid misunderstanding. Edward continued to argue with him. Man, if you continue to interfere with the work of the police, I will arrest you too. The policeman threatened him. Edward, don't. Emma suddenly spoke up. Please look after my children. Of course he promised. For some reason, Emma thought the policeman would lead her to some nearby station on foot. Instead, he put her in the back seat of the police car, not forgetting to handcuff her. They drove for at least 40 minutes, as far as the woman could tell, to the other side of town. At the police station, she was locked in a cage. It was hard to call this room differently. Wherever you looked from all sides, she was surrounded by bars. The size of the room was about 2 by 2 meters, and all of its furniture consisted of a rickety and hard stool, to sit down on which she did not dare to sit. She did not know how long it was before a scowling policeman, not the one who had brought her here, but some other one, opened the door of her cell and led her down some long, gloomy corridors to an interrogation room. There was a table where another man sat, a chair across from it on which Emma's escort sat, pushing her roughly before removing himself. "Emma Wilson?" clarified the investigator. She nodded. He made a notation in his notebook. "Emma, you are being questioned in a case of willful injury to life with aggravating circumstances. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to a phone call as well as the protection of an attorney. If for some reason you do not want to hire one, you will be provided with a public defender. I must also warn you that our conversation is being recorded. Is that clear to you?" Emma nodded again. "Well, good, then let's get started. Tell me what you did on the night of June 3rd through June 4th. She tried to describe the events of that terrible night in as much detail as possible. How she couldn't sleep, how she heard a suspicious noise and couldn't figure out what it was for a long time, how she finally realized that something was burning somewhere. She rushed to check the children's room and saw the fire in the window as she called the firemen and ran to Clara's house. But what happened next, she couldn't even remember. She must have been too shocked. The investigator, however, was not satisfied. He asked her endless questions, trying to get all the information he could out of her. She honestly tried to answer them, but she realized how unconvincing her words sounded. "Well, okay." The investigator stretched out, abruptly changing the topic of conversation. "As I understand, you and the deceased were close. Yes, you could say that." Emma replied. "Explain," he demanded. She went on again, recounting the circumstances of their acquaintance, the contract she had made with Edward. Then she tried to explain how it had come about that Clara had taken care of her children and had practically replaced their grandmother. "You cooked at her house, didn't you?" The investigator asked, as if again out of turn. "Did you have access to food?" "Well, yes," Emma said. "Could anyone other than you and your children have had access to the food in Clara's house?" "Edward probably. He brought groceries to his mother. Maybe someone else. She often had visitors, but I can't say for sure." The investigator looked at her, studying her, and then sighed heavily. "You see, here's the thing. Most likely she couldn't get out of the fire because she was sleeping very soundly and just didn't know what was going on. Forensics found a large dose of sleeping pills in her bloodstream. And you think," Emma said with horror in her voice, "that I slipped it into her system. Alas, we see no other options. We could, of course, thank Edward, but he has an airtight alibi. And don't look at me with such judgment. He's her son. That doesn't mean anything. Did you know that most often the perpetrator is someone close to the deceased?" Emma shook her head, then said, "Look, why would I hurt her? She was babysitting my kids, and I was getting the money I needed. Being her nurse and housekeeper all in one. Yeah, it's really messed up, but personally, I don't think you thought she was gonna die. Not everyone on this case agrees with me, but I still don't think you'd do arson. You probably slipped the old lady sleeping pills for some more innocuous purpose, maybe not even criminal, but you overdosed her. And you picked a very bad day to do it. That's what your behavior at the fire suggests to me. Witnesses say you almost burned yourself trying to get into a burning house. But why? Was it because you knew that Clara was asleep inside and couldn't get out on her own? Tell me the truth, Emma. I promise it will count for something in court." Emma exhaled sharply. Now she understood what the investigator wanted. He's being a good cop, pretending to be on her side, wanting her to confess that she did slip sleeping pills, and if she does, he'll go on to find out if she could have set the house on fire too. Purely by accident, of course. "I want a lawyer," she said sharply. "Well, that's your right." The investigator sounded disappointed. The lawyer for Emma was hired by Edward, who had all sorts of connections for every occasion. He had managed to get the woman released on her own recognizance, based on physical evidence and witness testimony. She was still a suspect, but the police had no evidence against her, only speculation. Emma hated to go back to the village. Yes, in the few months she had spent there, she had grown to love the place. But now it was soaked with the memories of the terrible incident. The woman, however, was not so much worried for herself as for the children. It is unlikely that now they will be cozy and quiet in their old home. Why don't you stay with me for a while? Edward suddenly suggested it. No, it would be awkward. Emma hesitated. It's not inconvenient at all. I live in a rather spacious apartment where I appear only once every 3 days. You won't make me uncomfortable there. After some thought, Emma agreed to his proposal. It was only when she arrived at Edward's house that she realized that he was obviously being modest. His rather spacious apartment had 2 floors and a dozen rooms. Each floor had its own front door, so that the inhabitants of the first and second tier could never meet. It used to be 2 separate apartments, Edward explained, but I'd always wanted a 2-story wonder like this, so I bought both and remodeled them. I've been thinking about getting my mom in here. Emma and the kids are comfortable on the 2nd floor. However, no one forbade them to go down to the 1st floor, but for some reason everyone was shy. Even though Edward hadn't lied, he was rarely at home, either working or doing something else. Periodically, her lawyer visited her to update her on the progress of the investigation. However, he had no particular news on the matter. The investigation still had no solid evidence against the main suspect, no new versions. The police were treading water. But one day, the lawyer appeared on the doorstep of Edward's apartment in a highly agitated state, and Emma immediately realized that the case had finally moved on. They searched the crime scene again, the lawyer said, for the 5th time, I think. But now they found something new? Emma guessed. Before they were only looking upstairs, but now they decided to check the foundation. And apparently, they found the source of the fire. They did. Exactly. There's a whole secret room deep in the house on the basement level. Apparently, that's what they tried to burn, doused it with gasoline and set it on fire. The fire then spread to the house. The police even suspect that the criminals didn't plan it. They just weren't too smart. But it was a waste. The room is practically the only thing that survived. There is a very strong metal door, and the whole room, apparently, made of heat-resistant materials. Apparently? Emma raised an eyebrow. Well, it's not clear yet. We couldn't get into the room. The door is very strong, and the lock is very complicated. We could, of course, use more drastic measures, but the police are afraid that they might damage some important evidence. There's no need for such measures. Emma said abruptly. The lawyer looked at her with bewilderment, and without explaining anything, she rushed to her room and dug among the hangings of the old jeans she had once worn in the vegetable garden. Frantically rummaging through all the pockets, and she exhaled with relief. Somehow, the item she was looking for hadn't gotten lost among the things. Let him try this key first, she said, holding it out to the lawyer. Not a sure thing, of course, but I don't rule out that it might fit. The lawyer continued to look at her, not understanding, even with some suspicion. Emma sighed and told him about how the workmen had broken the porch of her house trying to pull a malignant blighted tree root out of the ground, and how an old key was found in the wreckage of the porch. I thought at the time that it was from some old chest or something, she explained, and that my grandmother had lost it, and the chest had been opened and thrown away, or the lock had been changed. Maybe that's true, but I think that Clara might have given it to her for safekeeping, and she hid it under the porch, Or even, who knows, maybe Clara herself hid it secretly. Such an option cannot be excluded. Thoughtfully said the lawyer. It sounds quite logical, especially since the room is obviously stored something that was not intended for other people's eyes. Thank you, I'll pass it on to the police. Keep me informed. Emma asked. I will. With a slight smile, the man replied and disappeared. A week passed, followed by another, and the lawyer didn't even call. Emma was a little worried, but for some reason she didn't dare to call him herself. After all, he's a busy man. If he doesn't show up, he probably doesn't have any news on the case. Or if he did, but he had no right to talk about it. Besides, her mind was increasingly occupied with other things, like the fact that little Kayla had suddenly started calling Edward Daddy. Unlike her older brother and sister, she hardly remembered her real father, so it wasn't too surprising. Much stranger was the fact that James soon adopted the habit from her sister, but Mary persisted in calling him Uncle Edward. The twins, because of their age, had so far remained completely neutral in the matter. None of them had yet uttered their first word, though both of them were already crawling and even trying to walk. Edward himself, however, did not object to such treatment. On the contrary, he seemed to like it. He spent quite a lot of time with the children. Every time he came home, he brought each of them a present, and he always guessed who would like what. She was even beginning to catch herself feeling a different kind of sympathy for Edward than she had before. More and more often it occurred to her that he might actually make a good father for her children. She was afraid of that feeling, however, and tried hard not to let it fester. After all, she had lost her husband only a year ago. Was it decent to look at another man after such a short time? But she couldn't fool herself. Often Emma caught herself looking at his strong arms, his broad shoulders, or the aristocratic features of his face turned toward her in profile when he wasn't looking. As soon as she noticed it, she looked away. Sometimes it seemed to her that Edward knew exactly what was going on at such moments. More than that he liked it and that he was just as discreetly scrutinizing her as he thought no one was looking at him, but neither of them dared to make the next move. Perhaps it was simply too soon for that. The lawyer didn't show up until a month later. He was as bright as a Christmas tree and seemed eager to share his findings. However, when Emma opened the door for him, the first thing he asked was whether Edward was home. Not yet, but he should be within a couple of hours. Well then, if you don't mind, I'd prefer to wait for him. It's a long story that involves both of you, so I don't want to tell it twice. Right now, I can only tell you that the case is closed and all charges against you have been dropped. Really? Emma exclaimed happily. That's right, confirmed the satisfied lawyer. When Edward returned home, he found the two men in the kitchen. They were sitting at the table and drinking tea peacefully, chatting about some nonsense. When they saw him, however, they both jumped up and practically demanded that he change his clothes and join their company. Emma was panting with curiosity, and the lawyer with the desire to tell everything as soon as possible. Finally, when the landlord sat down at the kitchen table and was handed a mug of hot tea, the lawyer took a big sip from his mug and began his story. The longer he spoke, the more implausible the story seemed to everyone present. Nevertheless, every word he said was pure truth. And to begin with, perhaps, it is necessary to start with the fact that your key, Emma, perfectly matched the lock on the door. In fact, when the experts examined it, they had no doubts about it. They opened the door with all possible precautions. Nobody knew what might be inside. And when they opened it, at first they couldn't believe their eyes. The room was completely empty. Only a careful search in some dusty corner found a box, and in it documents. That's when the police had a new prime suspect. You'll never guess who. The headmaster of the village school? Unexpectedly, even to herself, Emma asked, "Exactly." The lawyer stared at her in amazement. "How did you guess?" Clara didn't like him. She suspected that he had thrown her out of her job on the pretext of her age in order to put his young mistress in her place. "And she was quite right," chuckled the lawyer. "I would even say that she didn't suspect it, but knew about it. The documents found in the box prove it, as well as the fact that the principal was dirty. He took money from students and parents for A's in exams and from teachers to cover up some of their sins. But listen to this, the police started digging into this principal. He didn't personally, after all, crawl under the house with a can of gasoline. Besides, it's unlikely he could have slipped her sleeping pills. She wouldn't have let him in. So he had at least one accomplice. A mistress?" Edward asked, "And her too." The lawyer nodded. Her role was to slip him sleeping pills. She came to Clara as if just to talk to her, and at first she didn't want to let her in, but then decided that nothing bad would come of it. She poured her some tea and decided to have a drink herself. And that's when, as you can imagine, the first act of this tragedy took place. The girl told the police during the interrogation and immediately gave up her lover when she felt that she was facing a very serious sentence for complicity. She swears, by the way, that she knew nothing about the arson. She thought the director's accomplices would just sneak into the house, find and take the documents, and that would be it. Honestly, I believe her. Well, she doesn't even look like an accomplice to something that serious. However, it's up to the court to decide how guilty she is, but more on that later. It turns out that this director has a second job. He is the head of some criminal group and sent some of his friends to the case, claims that the arson was not planned, and they really only had to take the documents. And these fools couldn't open the lock, so they decided to just burn the whole basement down. Well, this one's lying. Emma was convinced. Yes, he is. The lawyer objected. The police dug up so much on him that it doesn't matter whether it's more arson or less arson. In any case, he'll get a decent sentence. He's got a whole bunch of crimes on him. You can't imagine how many cases were closed at once, but the most interesting thing. He stopped and looked at Emma strangely, then continued. However, under the circumstances, it's probably not the best choice of words. I apologize. Anyway, his men are to blame for your husband's death. Emma shrieked in surprise, then covered her mouth with her palm. After a few seconds, she regained the power of speech, but the police said that they were acting as some unskilled criminals who didn't intend to harm him, but were just frightened, that's why. Yeah, they went to a lot of trouble to make the police think that, but it was the opposite. It was just a cover-up. But why? Emma asked. Edward had always been an honest businessman, never getting involved in any dubious ventures. What could he have done to cross them? The lawyer sighed. He had crossed them, but not them. They were only the executors, not the customers. Well, that's the unpleasant part. Apparently, there were at least 6 people involved. Emma remained silent and stared at the lawyer in horror. She guessed what he would say in the next moment. They were his parents, his brother, 2 sisters, and his maternal uncle. Perhaps some other relatives, but that could not be ascertained for sure. Motive, however. Emma sighed. She understood exactly what the motive might have been. Her. They all hated not only the homeless orphan, but also their own son, brother, nephew, who had brought her into their family, and in this terrible way had decided to take revenge on him and her at the same time. There was, besides personal animosity, also an inheritance. Finished the lawyer. Inheritance? Emma didn't understand. but there was a small amount of money, which, some of it went to me, but nothing else. The house belonged to his parents. If they wanted it so badly, they could just kick us all out without resorting to such measures, couldn't they? Not at all, objected the lawyer. The house belonged entirely to him, and the will should have left it to you. The documents you were shown were not real. There was a long silence in the room, and the lawyer was the first to break it. Digging into his briefcase, he pulled out some documents and handed them to Emma. This is yours. It confirms ownership of the house. You may return there at any time or otherwise dispose of it as you see fit. If you'll excuse me, my wife's waiting for me at home. In principle, everything I wanted to tell you. If you have any questions or need my services again, call me. He dressed and left the apartment, and Emma and Edward sat silently at the table for a long time, digesting what they had heard. Finally, without saying a word, the man placed his palm on hers. She turned her head and smiled warmly at him. Who would have thought they would take the next step towards each other under such strange circumstances? Emma wanted nothing to do with either her late husband's house or the one she had inherited from her grandmother. She sold both and used the proceeds to buy a spacious apartment in the city, which she intended to rent out. The remaining money went to various bank deposits, providing a stable future for the woman and her children. In the 11th grade, Mary went to her old school and graduated with a gold medal. Apparently, the events that took place had a strong impact on her choice of life path. The girl resolutely told her mother that she was going to go to law school to then go to work in the police. Emma, however, was not going to oppose her. James was sent to the same math boarding school, which looked for him Clara. But now that they lived in the city, he could go there as if he were going to a normal school after school, and when he returned home, the rules did not forbid it. On the contrary, the administration was only too happy not to have to find a place for him in the dormitory. Emma and Edward married the year Mary successfully entered the law faculty of one of the capital's universities. They were very worried about how the girl would take the news, but to everyone's surprise, she did not object, and was not even surprised to receive an invitation to the wedding. Mary spends all her vacations in the house of her mother and her new husband, and they are waiting for another, now a common child.
Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Christopher has lived in the countryside all his life and has never been to the city in his 28 years. After graduating from high school, he immediately trained as a tractor driver, and then his father got him a job. His life flowed, boring and monotonous. There was not much entertainment in the village. Young people went to the city, so even the young man had no friends left. His mother kept saying that the guy should also leave. In the village, you cannot even find a bride. The father was on the side of his son. He thought the boy should be closer to his parents. In a moment, or did she get fed up with it all? A school friend, Christopher Stephen, came to visit the parents. He lived next door, 2 grades younger. Of course, Christopher could not miss the opportunity to meet with his comrade. Stephen said that he had graduated from the institute and now worked in a cool firm. He came to introduce his fiancée to his parents. Stephen's girlfriend Adriana was a typical city dweller. She took pictures of herself, every tree from the barn to show her girlfriends. To observe the forgotten village, she was interested, but she could not live in such conditions. Both Adriana and Stephen looked at Christopher with sympathy and a little down on him. He didn't seem as modern and advanced as they were. "Why are you stewing here?" Christopher Stephen asked. "Move to the city. There are so many opportunities there and so much fun. What about here? There's fresh air, stability." Christopher defended his country life. "Who needs me in the city? And here, who needs you for chicken dinner? Made fun of the guy. Adriana, do you have anyone your own age around here? I haven't met anyone under 50 yet. Christopher shrugged. Perhaps he was the youngest of the residents. Stephen had invited a friend to the wedding, promised to show the town. He assured him that after that Christopher would never want to go back to his old life. The guy had long decided to go or not, but even his parents insisted that he could use a vacation. In the end, Christopher took out the only decent suit, which he had a jacket and pants left at him after the graduation party on, cleaned his shoes, and went by train to a new unknown to him, the world of the big city. The first thing that caught his eye when he came out of the station was the fast traffic and turmoil. Everyone was in a hurry. Cars were passing by at breakneck speed. Christopher had never seen so many cars and people in one place. He walked along the streets and looked at advertising signs, mannequins in store windows, cozy courtyards, cafes. It was interesting for him to observe it all. To get to Stephen, Christopher got into a cab. "You look so puzzled, as if you just came out of a coma," laughed at him. Cab driver as a passenger. "Maybe I am," pensively answered Christopher and continued to look at the street. "I am the first time in your city. It's beautiful here. The city is like a city. Nothing special. Stores, eateries. That's all there is to it." The cab driver waved his hand. He went on to talk about the unnecessary number of shopping centers, that it would be nice if they made roads and so on. Was Christopher not listening to him? He was immersed in his emotions and thoughts. Suddenly he felt that this was his home, that he had nothing to do in the village. There he would only get bored out of his mind. Christopher wanted a normal family work, walks in the park. Christopher had only been in town for half an hour, but he knew he would be back here for good. Upon returning home, Christopher quickly packed his things, quit his job, said goodbye to his parents, and got ready to go. His mom was very happy for her son. Finally, he decided to do an adult thing. His father also accepted his son's decision and did not argue. The last representative of the youth was escorted around the village. Mom cried in part. Finally, the son became an adult and leaves the parents' nest. Father, however, was worried that Christopher, with his childlike naivety and simplicity, would be quickly deceived in the city. He was worried that his son would be tempted by the temptations of the city and get into some kind of trouble. Stephen helped a friend rent an apartment. Christopher found work quickly. He was a jack of all trades. The guy got a job in a construction crew, doing interior decoration. The pay was good, so he could afford a lot. Christopher quickly changed his closet to a more fashionable, made a haircut. A month later, only memories remained of the humble country boy. He quickly got into the rhythm of the city. He had friends with whom Christopher relaxed on weekends in bars. Not once did Christopher regret his decision. One day, his crew was sent to a rich house. Such cottages the young man had never seen before. 2 floors, a huge territory, a swimming pool. One can only dream of such a place. The owner was a grown woman named Betty. Her husband had passed away long ago, and now she was running his business. She was a typical business lady. One look at her made one uneasy. She gave instructions as well as the foreman, though even he was afraid of her and would not argue with her. Betty didn't have much respect for the workers. She demanded that they do everything faster, but without losing quality. She walked around the grounds and constantly pointed out small flaws. None of the construction workers liked her. Christopher thought that this woman was deeply unhappy. That's why she had such a fierce temper. He felt sorry for her for some reason. One day, Christopher was laying tiles in the pool. It was a hot July day. The sun was beating down. It was unbearably hard to work under those conditions. But Betty had ordered him to finish the pool by the end of the week. So Christopher tried to get it done as quickly as possible without losing quality. "Would you like to sing?" a gentle female voice asked. Christopher looked up and saw a beautiful young girl. She was about 25 years old. She was wearing a light or not new dress, slightly developing wind, sandals on thin heels. Her hair was gathered in a braid over her shoulder. "I will not refuse," Christopher replied and accepted a glass of water from the hands of the beauty. When she leaned toward him to hand him the dress, he looked into her face. In appearance, she resembled Betty, but her features were softer and her eyes kinder. This was obviously her daughter. Apparently, she was not like her mother in personality either. She was attentive and very quiet. If Betty occupied all the space, the girl was quite inconspicuous. She spoke quietly and calmly. She spoke to everyone very meekly and respectfully. Several times during the day, the girl brought water, which was a lifesaver in this heat. Christopher noticed that sometimes he saw her silhouette in the window, and it seemed to him that she was looking at him. The fact that she offered only him a drink, he noticed it too. In the end, the guy pushed these thoughts away from himself because he did not think that such a girl could be interested in a simple worker. All the next week, the guy did not take his eyes off the beauty. He learned from his coworkers that the girl's name was Christina. She really was Betty's daughter. A lot of people noticed that she was showing interest in Christopher. She would offer him water or a cake. The boy was embarrassed by such a comment, but he was pleased. One day, he was about to go home after his shift. He heard a loud woman screaming. The sound didn't come from the house, but from the fence. There was no one around. Christopher was the last to leave. The girl ran in again. He decided to see what happened. Maybe someone needed help. The young man went around the fence and saw Christina surrounded by a whole pack of dogs. There were at least 10 of them. Each one bared its teeth in a vicious grin. Christina stood pale with fear, with the brick fence behind her. There was nowhere for her to retreat to. Christopher, not thinking long, looked around, found a long stick, and shouted loudly, "Get out of here." The guy walked straight toward the pack, waving the stick from side to side. Dogs are evil, or they were bailed out. But they were scared. One dog ran away first, and all the others ran away after him. "Thank you, rest," thanked Christina. "I have been afraid of dogs since childhood. I was once bitten by a neighbor's Rottweiler. It scared me for life." Christina lifted her skirt to show the bite. The scar was impressive, but Christopher was more attracted by the slender leg that the girl exposed. He even blushed with embarrassment. "Come on. Anyone would do the same," he said. "My name is Christopher, by the way. I guess we can get acquainted now." "Christina," the girl replied, smiling. "Maybe I'll buy you coffee or dinner." As a sign of gratitude, Christopher did not refuse to spend the evening in the company of a pretty girl is always nice. To dinner. He, of course, did not let her pay, although the amount in the check was impressive. Christina chose restaurants to her taste, and she was accustomed to all the best. After that evening, the guy had to squeeze hard financially to reach his paycheck. They talked all evening as if they had known each other for a long time. Christina listened with interest about village life. It was all a wonder for her. The girl told little about herself. She decided not to embarrass a simple guy with stories about the happy and carefree childhood of a child from a rich family. She had never faced any difficulties in life. The only tragedy in her fate was the death of her father. Her dad was into extreme sports. This led to the man's death. He crashed on a motorcycle. So now Christina was wary of two-wheeled transportation. Even bicycles she tried to avoid. After the tragedy, her mother became even tougher than she'd been before. She just lost her mind. She felt like the head of the family, even though she'd been in charge most of the time when her husband was alive. When Christopher returned home, looked at his bachelor's humble abode, his head was filled with sad thoughts. He liked Christina very much, but he realized that this girl was not at all on his level. She would never seriously consider tying her life to him. He would have to look at girls more simple, like those he meets in clubs. With Christina, he spent 2 weeks' worth of his budget in one night. The next day, Christopher didn't notice Christina. He figured the girl was embarrassed about last night's date and would avoid him from now on. The shift was noticeably duller without her. The coworkers also noticed that no one offered water or a skewer to the guy today. They were teasing Christopher, But he paid no attention to these bards. He wanted to finish his work as soon as possible, to complete this project and forget about Christina forever. The girl, however, did not regret the date in the slightest. She liked Christopher too, and unlike him, she had no prejudices about the difference in their social status. Of course, she had noticed the way his eyes had rounded when the waiter brought the bill. She had no illusions about the earnings of a mere construction worker, but the girl was pleased with the gesture that Christopher had performed. She didn't come to the construction site not because she was hiding from the young man. It was just that her friend had a wedding, and where Christina was a witness. She had no idea that her absence would make Christopher so sad. When Christopher saw Christina the next day, he couldn't contain his smile. It formed on his face. The girl responded in the same way. Both were a little embarrassed by their unexpected joy. "Why didn't I see you yesterday?" said Christopher, trying to contain his embarrassment. "My best friend was getting married." The girl shared the news. "Imagine, I caught the bride's bouquet." "Your boyfriend must have been happy," joked Christopher. Thus, he decided to find out if Christina had a suitor. He was embarrassed to ask directly. "I am a free girl," she replied and winked. "I will wait for my soulmate to show up." Christopher was pleased with this information. By the way, Christina was flirting with him. He guessed that she didn't mind accepting advances from him. Her smile and wink were quite unmistakable. Christopher took it as a sign. If the girl herself showed interest in him, he should take a risk and try to get her. Christina liked Christopher's modesty, his shyness, and simplicity. The guys in her circle were quite different. They were all arrogant, narcissistic. None of her acquaintances would give up their last dime for a favorite bill. They loved as much as they loved themselves. That's why the simple guy Christopher seemed so interesting to her. Buying a bouquet for him was an act. And those gorgeous flowers she received from other suitors, not for her, not for them, meant nothing. From that moment on, Christopher no longer shied away from anyone or hid his sympathy from his coworkers at their comments. He didn't care. He gave Christina flowers, took her to movies and restaurants. Yes, for this he had to touch his deferred money, which he planned to spend on buying a house. But Christina deserved the best. She wasn't the type who would be satisfied with a walk in the park and a daisy from the field. The girl accepted courtship, happily agreed to meetings. In fact, she did not really care what restaurant Christopher would take her to. But it was nice that he tried to please. The renovation of Christina's house was already finished. Christopher's crew had moved on to the next project, but their communication continued. 3 months into their relationship, Christopher proposed to Christina. He decided not to delay long. The guy determined that she was the girl with whom he wanted to spend the rest of his life. Christina said yes. It seemed to her that Christopher is a worthy man. He is kind, caring, such a great husband and father. He could always be counted on. He treated her with such attention and care that it was impossible not to fall in love with him. So the omen with the bouquet really works. Christina laughed. How quickly she found a husband. "I realized the first time we met that I want to share my life with you," Christopher confessed. "And your story about the bouquet just became for me a sign from above that it is impossible to miss such a chance." The lovers were happy. They were in no hurry to get married. They wanted to stay longer in the status of bride and groom, to rejoice in this romance, to enjoy each other. The wedding day was appointed only in 3 months to have time to prepare. Christina procrastinated for a very long time, and only one moment of the groom's acquaintance with his mother. Betty's character was not sugar. The girl herself tolerated a lot of claims from her. The woman had a whole list of requirements for her future son-in-law, and one of the first items was material well-being. Christopher flew straight through. He wasn't a pauper. But for Betty, anyone who didn't have a couple 1 million in his account was considered poor, unworthy in the views of a daughter. Betty did not believe in love. She herself was marrying out of convenience. So, for her own blood, she saw no other way. Christina was hesitant to admit that she was in a relationship with a young man, and if Mom finds out that they are already preparing for the wedding, She will be furious. And so, in fact, it happened. One day, Christina decided that she can no longer hide the truth from her mother. She is a grown-up girl and can choose for herself who is worthy of her hand and who is not. But the girl decided first to talk to her mother herself and then to present the groom. How many expensive sets were broken this morning? What eloquent speeches were heard from the people of the houses nearby? As soon as Christina mentioned the engagement, "I put so much effort into you to get you involved with some construction worker," yelled Betty, already spewed out the first wave of emotions. "I don't want to live my whole life with a man I hate, do you?" resisted Christina. "You think I don't know how you really felt about Daddy. You lived as neighbors, business partners, but not a happy couple. I want to understand what love is, to feel what it's like to be loved by a woman. Have you ever felt that way in your life? He's not your equal, that's it." Mother Love insisted. "These are fairy tales for little fools. When you wake up in a cheap apartment to the sound of a singing faucet, then you'll remember what I said. You have never seen what poverty is, when in the store you choose what is cheaper, when your socks are torn and you start to sew them up, because there is no money for new ones. You only have extremes in everything, either untold riches or absolute poverty and carrots on holidays." I laughed at Christina's mom. "We've already applied to the registry office, so your opinion doesn't matter." Betty blushed to the tips of her ears. Her anger made it hard for her to breathe. But the woman knew that her daughter was as stubborn as she was. It was useless to argue with him. The woman hoped that her daughter would realize that she had made the wrong choice. "We just have to wait. And I hope he didn't get you pregnant." "What's the rush?" she asked her daughter. Christina didn't even want to answer that question. She left to give her mom time to exhale and think again. She was not going to give up on her decision. Christina did not talk about her mom's violent reaction to the news of their engagement. The guy and himself guessed that she was not delighted. Therefore, unnecessary questions did not ask. His parents were happy for their son, but with the bride he did not hurry to introduce them to. Christopher thought that Christina was not yet ready to plunge into the life of the village. He decided to wait for us from the day of the wedding. That's where he would introduce Mom and Dad to his wife. Unfortunately, Christina never recognized her new relatives. Just a month before the celebration, Christopher got some sad news. There was a fire in his house. It happened at night. The parents didn't even realize it. They both suffocated from the smoke. Both died. Christopher felt responsible for their deaths. If he hadn't left his parents, he would have saved them. The guy became depressed, and if it wasn't for Christina, he would never have gotten out of that hole. The girl supported him. She was able to convince her lover that he was innocent of what happened. They certainly wouldn't want him to feel that way. When Christopher arrived at the funeral, he found that there was almost nothing left of the house. It had been completely burned down. The boy said goodbye to the village forever. There was nothing left to keep him here now. He got a payout from the insurance company. It was a modest sum, but the money was enough for a small studio apartment near the city center. There they began to live with Christina after the wedding. The girl remembered her mother's words about a tiny apartment with a broken faucet, but did not worry about it. "We will still have everything," she thought. She had not yet plunged into the problems of living together. She was a happy young wife. The couple's romantic period continued. It was time to inform Betty that Christina had become Christopher's wife. The girl hoped that her mother would not oppose it now. After all, everything was already done. She mentally prepared herself and Christopher for a difficult meeting, and they went to her mom. "You're not my daughter anymore." That's all Betty said when she heard the news of the marriage. "You can't count on me to help you. If you want heaven in a tent, you can have it." Christina tried to talk some sense into her mother. Explained to her that not everything in this life is measured by bank accounts. She said she'd never been happier with anyone than she was with Christopher. Betty called her daughter's words nonsense and told her to come home only when she got rid of that construction worker. She didn't want to listen to anything else. Christopher did not expect to hear anything else from a demanding woman. Christina was more upset than her spouse. She was offended for him. Mom did not even try to find out what a wonderful person her new husband was. The conversation ended on raised tones. The daughter announced that she herself did not want to know her mother anymore. Manny, she will not be in this house. Time passed. The romance of the first weeks of marriage slowly faded. Christina didn't work anywhere. She never did. Christopher, on the other hand, spent all day at the construction site to provide for his wife. She had many demands. Gradually, the number of gifts began to decrease. Christopher was dissatisfied with the fact that his wife sits all day and does nothing. But he never talked about it. He would come home after long shifts, run the laundry himself, scrub the floors, and cook dinner. His love was so strong that he was willing to put up with it all. The girl was slowly fading away. The veil of love matched her eyes. She felt real life. The money on the card, which was still left from her mother, began to run out quickly. After all, no one else had replenished it, and the young wife did not refuse from the usual spending. Christina began to look at her friends with envy. They continued to travel several times a year, buy things from expensive brands, regularly visit a beautician. Christina had to forget about all this. The joy of life. Christina returned pleasant news. The girl was pregnant. Christopher jumped to the ceiling when he learned that soon to become a father. One thing was sad: parents never lived to see grandchildren. They were happy with the good news. Christopher presented Christina with a diamond ring. It was the most expensive gift from him for all the time of their relationship. The girl decided that the news about the future grandchild would melt the heart of Betty, with whom Christina had not communicated for 2 years. The woman missed her daughter, but was too principled and stubborn to make contact and accept her daughter's choice. She waited for her call, but expected to hear that her daughter was coming home. But no way. News that Christina has decided to also have a baby from this beggar's belief. Get an abortion before it's too late. That's all. Betty replied to her daughter's message. It's too late, Mom. We even found out the sex of the baby. We're having a boy, announced Christina, who was in shock. She didn't think her mom would be so uncomfortable with her decision. So it will be the most unhappy child in the world, whose mother is a fool, whose father is a moron, Betty declared and hung up the phone. Christina decided that she would not call her mother again. Such words she, sorry, and could not. The girl cried, but not from resentment, but from anger. To realize that your mother is such a mercantile person was very hard. Christopher. The girl said that her mom just congratulated them on the addition, but refused to help. The girl decided not to go into details of the conversation, so as not to offend her beloved. The joy of pregnancy at Christina passed very quickly. It was hard for her. Cabs and constant pharmacies complicated the already difficult life. There was barely enough money for 2 people. How would they pull an infant as well? Christina didn't understand, or she had to take on even more part-time work. He was pulling the family alone. The girl stopped feeling the happiness of waiting for the baby. He had not yet come into the world, and Christina already considered him a burden. She counted on her mother to laugh at her and forgive her. After all, this is her first and perhaps only grandchild. But Mom's refusal to help drove Christina into depression and even despair. She spent hours looking at baby products, calculated how much money would be needed. Her hair was becoming frizzy from the prices. One day, Christina received a call from her mother. The woman apologized for her harsh statements and invited her daughter to visit. The girl happily agreed to meet. Already in half an hour, she stood on the threshold of her native house. Finally, the mother came to her senses. Now Christina's life will get better, and she will not need to count pennies. Choose whether you need a bathing chair or a high chair. Betty met her daughter kindly and even hugged her. Such tenderness from her mother Christina did not remember even in good times. The woman invited her daughter to the table. She got right down to business. Christina, of course I did wrong, Betty began to say, and I'm happy to have a grandchild. You're my only daughter. As soon as I saw you with that cute little belly, my heart melted. I'm very happy to hear that, the girl replied. But I still can't accept your husband, what he can give you and the baby. So I propose the following to you. You leave Christopher. You move in with me. All the expenses for your maintenance and the child will be on me. Christina thought about it. She didn't mind giving up her love for money. Living in a studio apartment and doing household chores was not to her liking. Her sense of pride was dulled. The desire for a beautiful life. Restaurants, resorts, brand name clothes. Betty was right. Everything is a comparison. The woman noticed that her daughter was thinking, not hysterical as she had been earlier. That fact pleased the mother. So, not all is not lost yet. And she continued talking. One more condition. But that's not all. And I found you a proper fiancé. He's my business partner. He was widowed 3 years ago. Never found a new partner. I'm asking about you, by the way. You'll marry him. You'll be in business for yourself. And you can help me. Christina's expression changed dramatically. She wasn't happy with that. She had hoped for things to be as they were before she got married. Why couldn't her mom just treat her like a daughter and not a business project? She's willing to put Christina under a creepy man 15 years older than her for her career. Mom, did you know that he was widowed because he killed his spouse? Christina asked. It has not been proven yet. Unperturbedly answered the mother. It won't be. With his connections and opportunities, only it won't bring the woman back. And everyone knows the story, including you. And this isn't the first time he's ruined a human soul. You're willing to sacrifice me to add paranoia to your account. Did you hear my offer? If you don't agree, go back to your doghouse. Betty replied just as indifferently. Christina was angry at her mother again. Only she had thought that everything would be as before. How her dreams were shattered by her mother's vanity. She glared at her, but didn't leave. Fine, you don't want to. Suit yourself. Waved his hand at Betty. Let's at least have tea. You probably haven't tasted normal tea in 100 years. The woman waved her hand to the servants to serve the tea. The governess obediently brought a tray with 2 cups from an expensive china set. She made some sign to Betty and left the room. Well, what's your happiness and the baby's health? Mom said and raised her glass playfully. Christina rolled her eyes. This ceremony in Mom always annoyed her. Betty always had to keep her face and act as pathos as possible. Her daughter played along and touched her heavier. I'm going home, said the girl T. Wait, it's been so long since we've seen you. At least tell me how you're doing. Betty watched her daughter carefully as she drank the drink. She didn't calm down until the girl took the last sip. Christina noticed it, but she was already used to her mom acting very strange sometimes, so she didn't pay much attention to such behavior. Now, however, it seemed to Christina that her mom purposely wanted to keep her home longer. She couldn't. Jean put something in her tea. Christina sat at her mother's for the second hour. Her mother's monotonous stories about rich friends and their children had bored her to tears. Betty was telling her who had married whom. Some favorable match. She was still trying to make her think it was a marriage of convenience. In the circles of people like her, that's the norm. Christina's patience ran out. She hailed a cab and said goodbye to her mom. Suddenly, Betty grabbed her stomach and screamed loudly. Mom, what happened? The girl was frightened. I don't know. I feel dizzy and my stomach hurts a lot. The woman replied. Suddenly, a trace of blood began to form on her snow-white pants. The stain increased right before her eyes. Christina immediately called an ambulance. She was very scared for her mom. The girl went to the hospital with her. By the time the ambulance arrived, Betty had lost consciousness. Christina walked from side to side in the hospital corridor. The girl couldn't understand what had happened to her mother. She looked perfectly healthy. She behaved as usual. Finally, the doctor came out to see her. The girl immediately rushed towards him. Your mom is bleeding, said the doctor. It's nothing. We stopped it. She's gonna be fine. Why did this happen to her? She's never had any problems like this with her health. That woman was as careful as anyone. She'd have prevented any disease from happening in the first place, probably some kind of hormonal disruption. The doctor replied, "Can you go in and see her?" Christina went into the room. Betty lay pale enough to blend into the white blanket, which was open to her chin. Despite her obvious weakness, she was telling someone off on the phone. Her voice was quiet, but still stern. "You couldn't give me a proper sign, like marking the mug, and I didn't go to the other side of the world," screamed Mom to the best of her ability into the phone. Somebody gave a quick squeak in a lefty, guilty voice, but the words were indecipherable. Betty's eyes, and covered with hatred and anger, "You're fired from this very moment, and don't expect any compensation. You will receive a recommendation accordingly." The woman hung up, and only at that moment she noticed that Christina was standing next to her. The girl had heard the whole conversation. It began to dawn on her. Why did Mom feel so bad, and why should it have been her? "You wanted to put something in my tea, and I understand correctly?" Christina asked sternly. "My girl, is it not what you think it is?" Betty started making excuses. Christina and no one else had ever seen such a look on that woman's face. Betty was startled and felt guilty. Her eyes ran from side to side in confusion. "Judging by the nature of your bleeding, you wanted to take my baby away from me. You wanted to induce a miscarriage, did you?" Christina asked even more sternly. Betty began to mumble something inaudible, and the girl realized that she was right. That realization just robbed her of any feelings for her mother. "How could you? That's your grandson. Do you realize how far along I am? It's killing a living person." "I'm sorry, just me," the mother said, tears spurting from her eyes. That's when Betty really realized what she had done. She stared at the table, angry with horror at her daughter, who looked at her like a wild animal. The woman felt like a monster. It became unbearable for her. Disgusted with herself and ashamed, she could not find words to justify herself. She just opened her mouth like a fish thrown on dry land. Christina abruptly left the room so that her mother would not see her tears. She realized firmly that she would never speak to her again. Of course, Christina was no angel either. Even in the morning, she was ready to leave the man she loved for money and a rich life, but she would never dare to kill. The girl returned home completely devastated. Christopher was frightened when he saw his beloved in such a state. Christina did not tell him anything. She was ashamed of her mother. In the evening, Christina felt sick. Her blood pressure was high and her stomach was very tight. Christopher was frightened for his pregnant wife and immediately called a doctor. Christina was put in the hospital for preservation. The girl had a threat of miscarriage. She blamed it on her mother, who almost got what she wanted. What she wanted? I couldn't get my head around it. How Betty could even think of such a thing. Christopher visited his wife every day. He always brought her flowers and treats, but Christina didn't need anything anymore. In the ward, she met the other boys-to-be. They bragged about gifts from their husbands. They told about the renovation of the nursery, how many things they bought. It was very hard for Christina to listen to this. Her child won't even have his own room. She couldn't afford to buy him 3 outfits a day. Christopher was doing everything in his power to provide the family with everything they needed, but he could not satisfy all of Christina's desires. The man began to notice that his wife is withering. What was the reason for her sadness? He didn't understand. He kept telling her not to be nervous. See what you've done to yourself. In an instant, Christina, I'm sick of it all. How can I not be nervous when I realize my child will never go to a good school? He won't have fancy clothes or good food. We won't be able to show him the world. The girl spoke up. And if both parents worked in our family, maybe we could afford more. For the first time in his life, Christopher reproached his wife for something, but he was offended to hear her claims. She knew she wasn't marrying a millionaire. Christina was dumbfounded by such words. She had never been forced to work in her life. She had never thought that she would get up early in the morning to go to some office, to get there through traffic. Although Christopher was right about one thing, she really did know who to marry. The most frustrating part of it all was admitting that Mom was right. After this situation, Betty tried several more times to reconcile with her daughter. She accepted her pregnancy and forgave her choice of a poor spouse, and was ready to help financially. But Christina didn't want to hear from her. And I didn't understand why the girl was acting like that. She dreamed that her mother was interested in her grandchild, and now she ignores her. He tried to ask a couple of times what caused such a drastic change. But by Christina's stern answers, I realized that it was better not to get involved in their family squabbles. 2 months later, Christina and Christopher had a son. They named him John. The boy was born 2 weeks premature. The girl believed that the premature birth was the fault of her mother, who made her very nervous. She never forgave her. One day, Christopher had the opportunity to rest and volunteered to go for a walk with his son. Christina gladly accepted such an offer. She could finally devote a few hours only to her beloved. The man did it for a reason. Betty had talked him into it. She wanted to see her grandson very badly. The reason for the mother-daughter conflict remained a mystery to Christopher. Betty dared when she saw her grandson. She didn't take her eyes off him for a moment. "He looks a lot like Christina," she said. "There's nothing of yours in him at all. John is too young to judge who he looks more like." Christopher replied resentfully, "And I want to have a serious talk with you," Betty said in a tone that wasn't cute at all. "You realize it's just Christina's life. She deserves more than that. And you put her in a room you call an apartment and keep her there. What are you implying?" With suspicion, Christopher asked, "I'll pay you any amount you name. And if you file for divorce, don't worry about the formalities. We will bypass all the laws." Christopher almost fell over when he heard such an offer. He was hoping that things would get better with his mother-in-law. She's starting her song again. Isn't it about time she accepted her daughter's choice? "As far as I know," Christopher answered, "Christina doesn't even want to hear your name. How are you going to get her back in the Duma? I will repeat to you what Christina once told you. Not everything is measured in money. If she hasn't left me yet, she's happy with me. You and your riches have lost her, mind you. And I don't keep her chained up in a room, as you put it." After that, Christopher never brought his grandson to his mother-in-law again. He couldn't understand people like her. Betty drove her daughter away herself. Was it really that important to her that she not be with Christopher? As time went on, John grew, developed. The boy was a year old now. Life seemed to be getting better. Christopher had almost saved up for a new apartment. In a few months, they were planning to move in. But their dreams were not to be realized. One day, Christopher didn't come home from work. Christina waited for him until 3 o'clock. She drew different pictures in her imagination. At first, she thought something had happened to him. Then, for some reason, she thought that Christopher must have gotten held up with some lady. Finally, she came to the conclusion that her husband had simply traded her for a group of friends with entertaining drinks. Women's imagination has no limits. Finally, the girl's patience broke down, and she decided to simply call her spouse. She was answered by a doctor from the hospital and reported that Christopher is in surgery. A concrete slab had fallen on his legs. There's a simple fracture in one leg. Nothing serious. But the other bone is completely shattered. It's gonna take the man a long time to recover. It's not certain he'll ever be able to walk again. Christina lost her temper when she heard what had happened. She quickly packed her slide and left him with a neighbor. She herself ran to the hospital to see her spouse. When she saw him, whole rivers and tears ran down her cheeks. Even though the doctor said only his legs were hurt, Christopher's whole appearance was ghastly. Huge bruises sat under his eyes. His arms were renamed. She took his hand and looked straight into his eyes. "Hold on. I'm here for you," she told her lover. He tried to smile back, but it was hard for him to do so. For Christina, it was a blow to the heart. Dreams of a happy life, of a new large apartment shattered. The money set aside to buy a home had to be given to treatment and recovery, or Christina hated the whole world during this period of her life. It would seem that tragedy should have brought husband and wife together. But for some reason, Christina became estranged from her spouse. It was a burden to care for him. Not only did little John require a lot of attention, now Christopher could not even wash himself. The girl simply unlearned from all the troubles that fell to her share. It took a year and a half before he was able to stand on his feet. Now he was an invalid. To work as before, the man could not, of course, work. Christina's pride evaporated. She forgave her mother. She began to accept help from her. Betty was glad that her daughter finally turned to her, although the occasion was not the happiest. She never said anything bad about Christopher again. The woman was glad that she was able to communicate with her grandson, albeit in this way. One day, Christina wondered, hadn't her mother built this tragedy? After what she wanted to do to John, the girl could expect anything from her. She didn't beat around the bush. Well, be honest, you didn't have anything to do with what happened to Christopher, did you? She asked. Betty pulled her eyes away. This time she was genuinely surprised, something she hadn't expected from her daughter. I'm quite the monster you think I am. I didn't even know what happened until you told me, she replied. Christina still decided that indeed it was too harsh even for her mom. Such thoughts never entered her head again. Christopher required care. A lot of Christina's time and energy went into helping her spouse. At one point, she got tired of it all. When Christopher was able to look after himself and even take care of his son, Christina began to leave home more often. She spent a lot of time in the company of her girlfriends, partying in nightclubs. Betty gave money to support John, and Christina went down on the entertainment. One day, she announced to Christopher that she was leaving him. She packed John her belongings and left her invalid husband alone. Left to himself, Christopher lost any meaning in life. The man found solace in a bottle of liquor. I myself did not notice how evenings in the company of alcoholic beverages became a constant for him. First he drank a little, then more and more, till he drank himself to death. He wasn't allowed to see his son. Betty tried to get him and Christina divorced as quickly as possible. Christopher tried to get John to see him more than once a month, but his ex-wife said she would terminate his parental rights if he continued to meddle in their lives. Christopher believed it was Betty who had sentenced Christina to do this to an unhappy man. She had never loved Christopher. She was always against their relationship. He even wanted to end it, but he didn't have the resolve. It's been 2 years since the divorce. Had Christopher lost his humanity? Neighbors called him the local drunk. No one wanted to hang out with him, so there was nothing left for the man to do but sink further to the social bottom. One of the next alcoholic evenings was revealed by a ringing doorbell. Christopher opened the door and rubbed his eyes to make sure he was not imagining things. Standing outside the door was Christina, her mother. The look on their faces was strained, friendly. They were smiling strangely. Obviously, this couple couldn't just show up at his door. "Hey, Christopher, how are you doing?" Betty asked, or was surprised by the man's unexpected courtesy. "Did you kill someone and want me to take the blame?" Christina and her mother looked at each other strangely, a little frightened. Then both of them simultaneously shifted their gaze to Christopher. The women were creeped out by the question, for he had hit the mark. They were in very serious trouble indeed. "Did I guess that?" Christopher was amazed. "Honestly, I don't even know where to begin." "I'm not sure," Christina said. "You've always been a compassionate person, amazingly kind. I've never met anyone like you. You've always done everything you could for me and more. How wonderful I am. I don't need you to tell me. Let's get down to business." Christopher couldn't take the hypocrisy of his ex-wife. He didn't really hold a grudge against Christina. The man realized that Betty was in charge of everything. She was the one who'd persuaded him to leave his destitute, invalid husband. In some ways, he even agreed with her. Of course, a girl like Christina deserved better. Christopher simply couldn't give her the life she wanted. "Yes, Christina. Let's resolve this issue quickly." Betty agreed with her son-in-law. "And I'm in trouble. I need your help. A few hours ago, I hit a man with my car. It was some drunk. He had no family, but he was still alive." Christina said. He was, Christopher pointed out. Yes, he died on the way to the hospital. Christina continued. Mom asked the coroner to hold off for now. You see, Christopher, I can't go to jail. I have a son, a career. A criminal record would just wipe out everything I've worked for over the years. I get it. You want me to go to jail. I mean, I got no son, nothing to lose. Is that what you think Christopher was angry about? Look at you. What kind of life is this? You have no job, no status. Betty stepped in. I'll make you a deal. You'll have great cell conditions when you get out. You can see John as much as you want. Help Christina. Prison will ruin her whole life. Is this a chance for you to get your life back on track? Of course, Christopher was unpleasant to hear himself say that, but Betty said that's right. The man's reputation had long since sunk below the minimum. Other than the Georgia bottle, he had no interlocutors. What did he care where to stare at the ceiling here, within four walls or in a jail cell? Against all his beliefs, Christopher agreed to help his ex-wife one more time. He took the blame. Christopher regretted his decision several times. He doubted that Christina really deserved such an act from him. When his husband was in a bad situation, she turned her back on him. She hadn't given him the support he needed. Why should he have to deal with her problems now? But it was too late to back down. He was the guilty party in the case. There was no going back. Let this be his payback for his naivety and kindness. Christopher was sentenced to 5 years. He was given the minimum because he pleaded not guilty, confessed to driving drunk without noticing. No idea where you were running from. He was completely remorseful. Betty's connections, of course. Christina even came to see him on a date at first. It was only a couple times. Thanked him for his help. Showed him pictures of her son. Christopher was even glad to be able to talk to her like that. He was starting to dream that when he got out, he'd get back together with her. They would live happily ever after. After his act, Betty warmed a little to her son-in-law. Then the visit and Christina suddenly stopped. Christopher was very worried about it. Every day he hoped that the warden would come and inform him that a beautiful woman, the mother of his child, was waiting for him. But Christina never came. When Christopher had finally given up hope of ever seeing his beloved again, he received a letter. On the envelope he read the name of the woman he dreamed of every day. It was a letter from Christina. She apologized that she could no longer visit him, told him how she had grown older. John shared his worries and even confessed her love. Christopher then slept with that letter under his pillow for another week, until he got a new one. It was even more tender. The man treasured all the letters he received from Christina. She wrote to him often, once or twice a week. They began to correspond. The woman sent him a picture of her son, which he hung over his bed. Christopher admired the son, remarked how much he looked like him. But there were traits of his mom too. He asked Christina to send him a picture of herself, but she refused. Said she didn't want other inmates looking at her. Christopher served his sentence in a colony where the regime was not very strict. Some prisoners even managed to sneak a cell phone. Once he asked one of them for a gadget. He had to give his rations to a criminal for 5 minutes of internet access for 2 months. Christopher went to Christina's social networking page. There he saw pictures of her on vacation. The man was surprised, because in her letters she did not tell that she flew to the sea. But he decided that she just did not want to alarm or upset him. For now he lay on a hard window pane and saw the sun only through the small window of his cell. It was basking beside the lascivious sea. Christopher again felt the harsh injustice of his situation, but dreams of his beloved dispelled his misery. Christina wrote that she missed him. The girl repented for leaving Christopher. She said she was waiting for him. Christopher himself had already begun to count the days until his release. The man dreamed of how they would be together again when he was released, how he would hug and kiss his beloved. The sentence stretched unbearably long in these dreams, and it seemed that it would never end. In prison, Christopher had only one contact with one person. It was a very young guy of 19 years old. He went to prison a year after Christopher. All this time, the man stayed away from the other prisoners. He was a loner. The frightened boy immediately caught Christopher's eye. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked for someone who didn't cause him fear. And he came upon Christopher, who was also scrutinizing him. The man himself approached the new prisoner and started a conversation with him. The guy's name was Robert. He was sentenced to 7 years. He had been sentenced for major fraud. He worked in a bank. He was an ordinary manager, making loans. The boss framed the young man, sent the young man to ruin his youth behind bars, and he got away with it and went to a warm country. Christopher didn't like injustice. He felt sorry for Robert. He understood perfectly well what it was like to be in such a place when you were not guilty of anything. The kid's mom was still out there. The woman worked as a simple cleaning lady. Of course, they didn't have money for good lawyers. And the pro bono lawyers didn't care much about their clients. They decided to stick together. Christopher thought the young man was taking the hardships of his imprisonment more and more seriously. No one wrote him letters. His mother was too ill to come this far away. Robert had no girlfriend, or at least the feeling that a woman he loved was waiting for him in freedom. Robert had nothing that would question his imprisonment and give him the strength to live. But 5 years later, Christopher woke up feeling like a free man. The last time he'd managed in this hated place. The last time he ate a tasteless breakfast of porridge. The last time he went through the humiliating inspection procedure. The gates to a happy new life opened before him. Somewhere out there in the city, Christina is waiting for him. She promised to cook him puffed pies on the stove, to boil that borscht. But it wasn't dinner he was waiting for. His dreams were all about her, the woman he had stood up for, saved from imprisonment. How many humiliations of all kinds he had to endure to finally be rewarded. The kiss and embrace of the woman he loved. Robert was sorry to say goodbye to his only friend in this unfortunate place. Now he was left here all alone. Was Christopher worried about the boy too? He was to spend another 3 years in prison. Now he had no companionship. He was going to have a much harder time. Christopher decided to write him letters so that Robert wouldn't die of loneliness. No one met him at the gate, not even a cab, but he was not upset. Nothing could upset him that day. Encouraged by his loving reverie, he walked to town. Christopher watched nature, which was just waking up from its winter hibernation. He looked at this forest every day through the cell window, and it seemed so distant and uncriminal to him. And now he stood next to these trees, could touch them, smell the fresh resin. Even the sky beyond the fence was fresher and cleaner. The grass wasn't interpreted by a dozen mere criminals. It grew along the road, untouched by anyone. The man walked without looking around. He had only one goal, after all, to get to town as soon as possible. But suddenly he heard someone crying. Christopher tried to ignore it and went on. But the sound only grew stronger. The man could no longer ignore it. It sounded like a woman crying. He looked carefully deep into the forest and noticed some movement there. Christopher went towards this moving. After walking a few steps forward, Christopher realized that there was a man there. He approached again and froze. There was an old woman sitting by a tree. She looked very unhappy and shabby. She had evidently spent several days in the woods. Her face was sooty, clothes in hibernation on and torn in several places. "Grandma, what happened to you?" "Careful," he asked. The old lady did not answer. She was disoriented, did not even notice that someone approached her. Christopher came closer. He tried not to scare her too much. Finally, she turned her attention to him. Her eyes were distraught. She did them a few times and squinted to get a better look at the approaching man. "Are you an illusion or a real person?" In disbelief, she asked. "Real you can touch," good-naturedly replied Christopher. "What are you doing here?" Grandma said that 3 days ago she went into the forest, but she couldn't get out of it. She got lost. Christopher calmed her down, said that she was just a few steps from the road. But the old woman had given up hope of rescue. She gave up and sat down under a tree to die in peace. Death is canceled for today, Christopher announced cheerfully. You must be very hungry. He took out a bun from his pocket, which he had left from breakfast. Christopher hoped, of course, that Christina would come for him, but he didn't count on her much, so he decided to take some bread with him on the road just in case. It was a good thing he hadn't gotten hungry yet. Grandmother greedily chewed on the lush rebellion. Prison bread was not tasty, but after so many days of starvation, it seemed like a delicacy to Grandma. I think we should get out of here, Christopher suggested. The old woman nodded obediently. She wanted it just as much. Christopher led Granny out of the woods. She was surprised to notice that she was actually going to die. Just 20 paces from the road, Christopher told her he was on his way to see his beloved. The old lady remembered that she had once had love. She said it was a feeling that had to be fought for. It was the only thing that gave life meaning. Did Christopher agree with her? If it wasn't for Christina's letters in prison, he wouldn't have survived. They gave him moral support. Fortunately, about 15 minutes into their journey, a car drove down the road. The driver agreed to give the grandmother a ride into town. Christopher did not fit into the car, but he was not upset and continued on foot. Christopher did not notice how he passed 10 kilometers on the road and found himself near the city. How much did he miss the noise of the construction site? Car horns, snippets of conversation. How many people are there? Everyone's got their own families to worry about. Everyone's in a hurry. Christopher walked alone and scrutinized the faces, different from those of his fellow inmates. The man had a similar feeling the day he first got out of his village. There, too, he had been imprisoned. Now he felt that pleasant sense of freedom. With all his legs, Christopher rushed to the cherished house where they had first met, where he'd been barred for years and years before prison. To Christina's house, where she was already waiting for him with promises and pies, where his son lives, already very grown up. Even the inevitable meeting with his hated mother-in-law didn't dampen his mood. An hour later, Christopher pressed the bell. His heart was ready to fly out of his chest. He was anxious. 1,000 times he imagined this meeting and couldn't believe he had waited for this moment. Finally, the door opened, but behind it stood a different woman than the one he had dreamed of meeting. The door had been created by Betty herself, not even sent a governess to do the job. Well, hello, Vitek, jokingly and even affably greeted Betty. You're free already. No, they let him out for a walk. Christopher was burning with impatience. Where's Christina? She's not here. Don't take this the wrong way, but don't come here again. Instantly, Christopher's world went black and white again. What's that old Nigra up to again? How many times can you mix it up with Christina? Happiness. Where is Christina? I ask again. Christopher was shaking with anger. She said she was waiting for me, dreaming of meeting me. And you're prying again. I do not know what you made up for yourself, but Christina has already married a foreigner 2 years ago and moved to France with him. She's not here. Why are you telling me fairy tales? Christopher was losing his temper. She wrote to me a month ago that she couldn't wait to meet me, that she loved me and everything like that. Maybe someone was just playing a joke on you, Betty suggested. The woman pulled out her phone and showed pictures of Christina standing in front of the Eiffel Tower in the arms of a man. Then pictures from the wedding. Christopher couldn't believe his eyes. How many years he'd been living in his imaginary world. He'd just been tricked, given false hopes. Did you set it all up? True to hissing irritation, Christopher spoke. Put me in jail and gave my daughter away quickly to someone else. How cleverly did you pull that off? No humanity at all. 5 years. 5 years I lived with the mere hope that Christina and I would be together. She should have been the one rotting in a cell, sharing her life with thieves and murderers. That was where she belonged. Betty did not portray a single emotion of restraint on her face. The woman could only be envied. Of course, she understood how hurt and resentful Christopher was right now, but there was nothing she could do about it. Christina was gone. She was never coming back, and she was never going to resume her relationship with Christopher. The girl didn't write him any letters. It was someone's evil joke. But you spent 5 years believing you were okay, said Betty. It's a lot easier to live knowing someone loves you and waits for you. And finding out that it's all a lie you think is easy and nice too. Realizing you've been living someone else's fantasy for 5 years. Christopher said it very well. He was suffering, and he couldn't hide it. The tears were flowing. The man could not hold them back. He raised his eyes to the sky and prayed that it would end, that someone would wake him up now and tell him that it was all just a terrible dream. Christina was really waiting for him and loving him. But no one woke him up. The dream was not interrupted. Betty closed the door and leaned her back against it. On the other side, she could feel Christopher pounding on the metal, heard him yelling and demanding to open it. The woman was crying. She knew he was hurting and hurt, but there was nothing she could do. Find words of support and comfort. Betty simply wasn't capable by nature. As Betty grew older, her fervor moderated a bit. She became sentimental. The woman clutched at her chest. Her heart ached for this man. She blamed herself for doing such a cruel thing to her son-in-law. Her conscience tormented her and prevented her from living. She did not love Christopher, but she believed that no one deserved such cruelty. Christopher sat under the gate all afternoon and evening. Betty went to the cameras to see if he had left, and each time she noticed that he hadn't. Christopher hadn't moved. She sighed heavily and moved on. In the morning, Christopher was not at the fence. The woman exhaled with relief. She would not be able to watch him suffer for another day. But she couldn't help him either. The daughter had left for good. She wouldn't go back, especially not for her ex-husband. He left already at night. He realized that there was no point in waiting. It was hard for a man to get used to the idea that the woman he loved did such a cruel thing to him. Who was writing letters on her behalf? He didn't want to find out. He liked to think that it was she who had confessed her love to him. Let everything remain as it was in his fantasies at least. Christopher continued his miserable existence in a small studio apartment with no one left. Friends had disappeared back in the days when Christina had been fine. He devoted too much time to work, did not have time to meet anyone. What was all this hardship and effort for? To end up with nothing, sitting alone in an empty apartment, living on disability allowance. Then he moved to the city. These thoughts tormented the unhappy man, but he decided that he would no longer give up. Let fate was cruel to him. He would no longer pour alcohol on his grief. He's already lost too much. Couldn't Christopher get a job? Injury prevented the disability allowance from being enough for a modest bachelor's life. Out of boredom, he started woodturning. He remembered that as a child he'd enjoyed it. He made portraits and paintings. Pretty soon the whole apartment was filled with his works. He posted them on his social network page. One day his old acquaintance, Stephen, joined him as a friend. They corresponded for a long time. The man shared his story with his wife. They were doing well. They had 2 children. Christopher also told his sad fate. Stephen was very worried about his comrade. He decided to visit him to brighten the loneliness of an old friend. They talked all night. Stephen became interested in Christopher's hobby. He asked him to make a portrait of his wife. She was about to have a birthday. Then her girlfriends wanted one too. Stephen was happy to share his friend's contact with the women. They began to order portraits from Christopher. One of his clients was particularly interested in him. To be exact, not she herself, but the woman whose portrait he was doing. The woman had ordered a gift for a friend. Christopher found her profile from her photo and took a chance on writing. The woman's name was Kelly. She was the same age as the man, just as lonely. A friend had already told him about it. Christopher started a correspondence with Kelly. After 2 weeks of virtual communication, he decided to invite her on a date in person. The woman said yes. Christopher started courting her, sends flowers, invites her out on dates. Kelly didn't refuse his attention. She was a widow. Her husband passed away 5 years ago. She'd been lonely all that time, so the man's attention was nice to her. Despite the difficult life story, Christopher was not a bad man, so he was able to gain favor with Kelly. It had been a month since Christopher was a free and almost happy man. He continued to communicate with Kelly, but did not venture into a more serious step. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to provide for a woman again. He didn't want history to repeat itself. One day someone knocked on the door of the apartment door. He opened it and saw an unfamiliar man in a suit and a very serious look. "Hello, Christopher," clarified the guest. "That's right, Christopher. I came to inform you that there is an inheritance in your name. Could you sign the papers and come to this address tomorrow?" The stranger held out a card with the address of the notary's office to draw up the documentation. This is a new kind of fraud. Christopher didn't believe the guest. "I have no one. Who would leave me an inheritance? All relatives of the dead. Why would I lie to you? Come back tomorrow, please." The man turned around and left. Christopher was left in complete incomprehension of what was happening. Maybe he had some uncle or aunt who could make a will, but he had never heard from his parents about kin. He decided to go after all to clarify the matter. After all, it was just curious. Even if it was a hoax, he would figure it out quickly. There was still nothing for him to do. The next day, Christopher dressed decently, even shaved and styled his hair. He wanted to look solid, so that the scammers did not consider him a simpleton. The man arrived at the address. Yesterday's stranger was already waiting for him. "You have been left a large sum of money in a house," said the man. "Now we will go to the house. You will see it, so that there will be no claims against us." Christopher got into the car with the stranger. He was surprised to see that he had been driven to Betty's house. He had lost all sense of direction. His mother-in-law had decided to play a joke on him again. Well, she wouldn't take it. Christopher was informed that this was the house he had inherited. He read the deeds and learned that Betty had made him heir to her entire fortune. How was that possible? Christopher could not believe what was happening. Finally, the man introduced himself. He was the woman's personal lawyer. Betty had died a week ago. She had been suffering from a heart condition for a long time and knew she didn't have long to live, which was why they were concerned about the will. To close any questions Christopher might have, she wrote him a letter. He opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Christopher, I have done many bad things to you. Now I want to make amends. It is a pity that I realized all my mistakes so late. Maybe if I had accepted you right away, all the misfortunes you had to go through would not have happened to you, and I realized that you're a good man. When you first brought John to me, Christina hated me, and you went along with it. As soon as you got in trouble at work, Christina immediately told me that she wanted to leave you and agreed to marry the man I grabbed her. But I refused, and I insisted that she had to help you. She didn't last long. As you remember, she left you anyway. When the car thing happened, I also asked her not to ruin your fate, but she insisted that you would agree. She also knew that you were a very good and reliable person. I believed and hoped until the last moment that you would say no. When you agreed to take the blame, I was once again convinced that I'd never met anyone worthy of you. It hurt so much when I watched you in court. I realized that your life was being ruined. Christina left for France almost immediately after your incarceration, and I made her come to the visits. I wrote those letters, but I didn't want you to be hurt. I wanted to do something to brighten your stay in the zone. Unfortunately, I haven't forgiven my daughter, and I won't. What she did to you was inhumane. To make it up to you, I've decided to leave the business, the house, and the savings to you. Christina won't get a penny from me. She doesn't even know I'm sick. We stopped communicating a long time ago. I think you can manage that money properly. You're not a stupid man. Forgive me if you can, and I want you to know that I love you like family. All my efforts to talk sense into my daughter have been pointless. It was my own fault, and I paid for it. After Christina went abroad, she didn't even call me once. I became useless too. I guess I deserved to be treated like that. I hope at least my memory will be good. I apologize. Once again, I hope you find happiness in this house." Did Christopher read the message from his mother-in-law? Tears were running down his cheeks. He recognized the handwriting immediately. For 5 years he had stared at those letters in his prison cell, so everything written here was true. Christopher looked at the notary and waited for some comment. "Sign the papers now." That's all he said. Christopher silently took the pen and left his signature. He was now the rightful owner of this mansion. He went outside and looked at the pool where he was laying tiles. It was here that Christina stood and watched him. And here he sat and tried to furtively glance at the beautiful girl. "I must remove this pool immediately so that it does not remind me of that time," Christopher thought. He went further to look around the rooms. In the study on the desk, he found his letters that he had addressed to Christina. Some of the letters were sprawled out. Apparently, whoever had read them earlier on the paper had tears. But it wasn't Christina. She hadn't even received them. Christopher realized how wrong he had been about Betty. How many curses had he wished upon her? She was his greatest enemy. He hated the woman. There were conflicting emotions inside him now. It turns out she was on his side almost all the time. He had so identified with Christina. She was willing to trade him for some old man for money, deprived Christopher of his son. Will he ever see him again? The lawyer said Christopher didn't have to worry about the business. There have been supervisors there for a long time who oversee the whole process. Christopher will only receive replenishment. There will be no need for his involvement. The lawyer himself will always be available. Christopher didn't move into the mansion right away. It took him a while to get used to the idea that he would now have a huge fortune. He didn't move in until a month later. In the meantime, he continued to care for Kelly. With the woman he loved, he did not share the news of his wealth. For the first time after the move, he hid from her new place of residence. When Christopher became convinced that Kelly was not interested in money, he decided to invite her to his luxurious house. Kelly did not change her attitude towards him. Christopher did not notice any change in her behavior either. When Christopher heard that Betty's lawyer would now work for him, he remembered his prison buddy Robert. He asked the specialist if there was any chance of getting the party an early release. "Anything can be done with your powers," the lawyer answered him. Christopher quickly recalled in his memory the name of Robert and gave the number of the colony where he was serving his sentence. The lawyer promised to solve this issue within a month. In fact, it took him only 1 week to release the guy. The case was not as complicated as it seemed at first glance. After being released, Robert was brought to visit his savior. "And you didn't tell me you lived so richly," amazed at the luxury of the mansion. "Robert, how can I ever thank you? Just try not to get into any more stories." Christopher laughed back. "And I got rich just recently." On top of that, Christopher decided to give Robert his old apartment. He had so much money now that there was no point in selling it. He could afford to buy 100 of these studios. It was sitting idle. Robert could not believe his good fortune. He fell to his knees in front of his savior and said thank you without stopping. Christopher got him a low-level position at his company. If he performs well, he'll eventually get a promotion. Under Christopher's leadership, you don't have to worry that someone will cheat or set him up again. Christopher's good deeds didn't end there. He decided to thank everyone who ever met him in life and showed him sympathy. The man did not forget about his friend, who once pulled him out of the village and helped him get settled in the city. Since Stephen had everything in life was good, he did not need money. Then Christopher decided to simply realize the dream of a school friend. He had always dreamed of seeing the ocean. The man paid for a fancy tour for him and his family. Stephen promised not to forget such a chic gesture and someday respond with the same wonderful gift. Christopher also remembered about his grandmother, who was saved in the forest. The same lawyer who had gotten Robert out of jail had helped him find her. The grandmother said she didn't need anything. She was already grateful for saving her life. But Christopher noticed that the house she was living in was about to collapse. He bought her a new place to live. The old lady recommended that Christopher run for mayor of the city. She would vote for a man with such a kind heart. Christopher just laughed in return. When all the good deeds were done, the space debts were paid back. Christopher thought about his own life. He was tired of being a bachelor. He dreamed of having a favorite woman at home with whom you can spend joint evenings, discuss the news. The man decided to make Kelly a proposal. He did it very beautifully in a chic restaurant with live music and a huge bouquet of flowers. Of course, the woman could not refuse her favorite man. A year and a half later, Kelly and Christopher got married. The wedding they played chickly. Finally, he had everything he dreamed of, and even more. A wife he loved, a beautiful big house where he and his wife had remodeled. Was Christopher happy? So much torment and suffering he had to endure. Now he could breathe and live in peace. Who would have thought that he would help realize the dreams of Betty, who at first hated him? Did Christopher visit her grave more than once, talk to her? Said he was sorry they'd never been able to resolve their differences while she was alive. She must have been a good person too, or she just wouldn't have done that to him. The man held no grudges against Christina. He considered himself above it. If she thought him unworthy of her heart, her right. He was still grateful to her for a few happy years and together. Did they have anything to remember? Maybe one day they would meet and apologize to each other. 12 years have passed. Kelly Eel's life flowed calmly and measuredly. They had traveled halfway around the world and had made a lot of impressions. It was a frosty winter day. They didn't want to go outside. Suddenly, someone disturbed the couple's peaceful vacation. A young boy came to visit Christopher. The man immediately recognized him. John joyfully exclaimed, "Christopher, what have you become? Grown up already?" The young man rushed to his father's neck. He said that his mother did not let him go to Christopher. He was looking forward to coming of age to meet his father, whom he didn't remember at all. He hadn't expected to see him here. After all, Christina had told him that Grandma lived in this house. So many years had passed, and she didn't even know that her mother had died. The son told her that her mother divorced the Frenchman. She works as a waitress and doesn't live in luxury. Dreamed of all his life. The young man pays his own tuition and helps his mom, but she still doesn't want to come home. Christopher promised that he would take care of his son's tuition. He also said that Christina can come to visit him and talk to him if she has such a desire. Christopher is willing to help her as well. John visited his father for only a week, but he left, promising to come and visit several times a year. The young man lived in France, studied at the university there. Now, Christopher could say with certainty that he was the happiest man on earth, because his greatest wish had come true. He began to communicate with his son.